The night the black stallion broke free, Margaret Whitmore stood alone in the storm while every man in Red Hollow ran for cover. They called her the woman nobody wanted, too plain, too old, too quiet to matter. But when lightning split the sky and chaos tore through Ethan Mercer's ranch, she was the only one who could stop it. What happened next changed everything they thought they knew about strength, beauty, and the woman they'd spent 17 years ignoring. Stay until the end to see how the outcast became the legend. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that morning carried more than cold. It carried judgment. Margaret Whitmore walked down the dirt road from the First Baptist Church of Red Hollow with her head high and her hands folded neatly in front of her worn gray coat. Behind her, she could hear them. She always heard them. 38 and still alone, Clara Bennett whispered to her daughter, loud enough to carry. You'd think she'd at least try. Try what, Mama? The girl asked innocently. To be, pleasant, softer, the way men like. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn around. 17 years in this town had taught her that responding only made it worse. They wanted her to react, to cry, to show them the wound. She refused. The February sun hung pale and useless in the sky, offering no warmth against the brutal Montana winter. Ice clung to the edges of buildings like claws. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, desperate threads. Red Hollow wasn't much. A scattering of rough wooden structures, a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse during the week. But it was all Margaret had ever known. She'd been teaching here since she was 21. Arithmetic, reading, penmanship, history. Year after year, watching children grow up and leave while she stayed exactly where she was. The young girls she'd taught now had babies of their own. Some of them brought those babies to her classroom, and Margaret taught the next generation while trying not to think too hard about what that meant. Miss Whitmore! She turned. Thomas Brennan, one of her students, ran toward her with his little sister stumbling behind him. Miss Whitmore, wait! Margaret stopped, a genuine smile softening her face. Thomas, Sarah, what are you two doing out here? Your mother will be looking for you. We wanted to give you this. Thomas thrust a small, clumsily wrapped package into her hands. For your birthday. Sarah and I saved up. Margaret's throat went tight. She hadn't told anyone it was her birthday. You didn't have to. We wanted to, Sarah said shyly. You're the best teacher ever. Inside the brown paper was a handkerchief, simple white cotton with tiny blue flowers embroidered in the corner. The stitching was uneven, clearly done by a child's hand. Sarah made the flowers herself, Thomas said proudly. Took her 3 weeks. Margaret knelt down, not caring that her skirt touched the frozen mud. She pulled both children into a brief, fierce hug. Thank you, both of you. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's given me in a very long time. They beamed at her, then ran off laughing back toward the churchyard where their mother was calling. Margaret stood slowly, tucking the handkerchief carefully into her coat pocket. The most beautiful thing in a very long time. That was true. And sad. And exactly the kind of truth she'd learned to live with. She continued walking. The road curved past the mercantile, past the blacksmith shop where Henry Morrison was shoeing a horse, past the boarding house where miners stayed when they came down from the mountains. Every step was familiar. Every building held a memory of smallness, of being overlooked, of existing in the margins of other people's lives. Margaret! She turned to see Ruth Ann Cooper hurrying toward her, skirts lifted to avoid the mud. Ruth Ann was one of the few women in town who still spoke to her with something resembling kindness. I heard Vernon Pike's daughter is getting married, Ruth Ann said breathlessly. 4th wedding this month. Can you imagine? Margaret could imagine. She'd been imagining it for 17 years. I'm happy for her, she said simply. Ruth Ann's face softened with pity, which was somehow worse than the mockery. You know, my cousin's husband has a brother who's looking for a wife. He's a bit older, lost his first wife to fever, but he's got a good farm in Wyoming, and I'm not interested, Ruth Ann, but thank you. Margaret, you can't just keep waiting for... I'm not waiting for anything. Margaret's voice was gentle but final. I have my teaching. I have my students. That's enough. It wasn't enough. They both knew it. But it was all she had, and she'd learned to carry it with dignity. Ruth Ann sighed. Well, if you change your mind. I won't, but I appreciate the thought. Margaret walked on, leaving Ruth Ann standing in the road with that same pitying expression everyone wore when they looked at her. The spinster schoolteacher, the woman nobody wanted, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about what happened when you weren't pretty enough, charming enough, willing enough to diminish yourself into something a man could find useful. Her small house sat at the edge of town, a one-room structure with a narrow bed, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves full of books. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She was reaching for the door when she heard it, shouting, loud, urgent, coming from the direction of the Bennett Ranch just west of town. Then a crash that made the ground shake. Horses screaming, not the normal sounds of animals being worked, but genuine terror. Margaret turned and walked quickly back toward the main road. Other people were already moving toward the noise. By the time she reached the Bennett Ranch, a crowd had formed around the largest corral. She pushed through carefully, trying to see. Inside the corral was chaos. A massive black stallion, easily 16 hands high, muscles rippling under a coat that shone like wet coal, was rearing and plunging, hooves striking the air with deadly force. 3 ranch hands clung to the fence, bleeding and covered in dirt. 2 more lay in the mud, groaning. The horse's eyes rolled white with panic and rage. "Whose animal is that?" someone shouted. "Ethan Mercer's," another voice answered. "Bought him off a trader last month. Said he needed a stud horse for his breeding program." "Breeding program?" A harsh laugh. "That beast's gonna kill someone before Mercer ever gets near him." Margaret's eyes found Ethan then. He was younger than her by almost a decade, maybe 30, with dark hair and a lean, wiry build that spoke of hard work and not enough food. His face was set in grim determination as he climbed over the fence into the corral. "Ethan, don't be a fool." Vernon Pike stood outside the corral, arms crossed. Pike was the wealthiest cattleman in 3 counties, and he knew it. That animal's loco. Put a bullet in him and be done with it. "I paid good money for this horse," Ethan said tightly. "I'm not killing him because he's scared." "Scared?" Pike laughed. "Boy, that horse is mean." "He's scared," Ethan repeated, but there was doubt in his voice now. Margaret watched as Ethan approached the stallion slowly, hands out, voice low and calm. The horse stopped moving, ears pinned flat against his skull. For a moment it seemed like it might work. Then the stallion charged. Ethan barely had time to turn before the horse slammed into him, sending him flying backward into the fence with a sickening crack. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up. Women screamed, men shouted. 2 ranch hands dragged Ethan out of the corral while the stallion continued to rage. "Somebody shoot that animal," Pike bellowed. "No!" Ethan's voice was weak but fierce. He was sitting up now, blood running from a cut above his eye. "No, give me another chance. You'll get yourself killed. It's my horse. My decision." Pike shook his head. "You're going to lose everything, Mercer. The investors are watching. They see you can't even control your own stock. They'll pull out of the cattle deal. You'll lose the ranch." Ethan's face went gray. "I know." "Then be smart. Cut your losses." Margaret stood at the back of the crowd, watching. Everyone else saw a dangerous animal, a problem to be solved with violence or money. But Margaret had spent 17 years teaching children, learning to see past behavior to the fear underneath. And when she looked at that stallion, she didn't see rage. She saw terror. The horse wasn't attacking because he was vicious. He was attacking because he was cornered, overwhelmed, desperate to escape something he couldn't understand. His ears kept swiveling toward the crowd. His nostrils flared at every shout. He was drowning in sensory chaos, and violence was the only language anyone had offered him. Almost without thinking, Margaret moved forward. She didn't push through the crowd dramatically. She simply walked quietly to the fence and stood there, still and silent. The stallion's head swung toward her. Their eyes met. Margaret didn't smile, didn't coo, didn't make any of the performative gestures she'd seen men use with horses. She just stood there, breathing slowly, letting the animal see that she wasn't a threat. The stallion's ears flicked forward, just slightly, just for a second. Then someone shouted, "Get back, ma'am!" And the moment shattered. The horse reared again, and Margaret stepped back into the crowd. But Ethan had seen it. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, surprise, confusion, something else underneath. He climbed to his feet, swaying slightly, and walked toward her. "What did you do?" he asked. "Nothing," Margaret said quietly. "I just stood still." He looked at you. He calmed down. For a second. That's more than anyone else has managed. Ethan's eyes were sharp despite the blood on his face. Do you know horses? No. Then how? I know fear, Margaret said simply, and that horse is terrified. Ethan studied her for a long moment. Around them, the crowd was already dispersing, muttering about the crazy stallion and the fool who'd bought him. Vernon Pike was talking loudly about investments and respectability and how Ethan needed to get his house in order. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said slowly, would you? But before he could finish, Pike's voice cut through the noise. Mercer, a word! Ethan hesitated, then nodded to Margaret and walked away. Margaret stood by the fence, watching the stallion pace the corral. His sides heaved, his hooves struck the ground in sharp, panicked rhythms. No one else was looking at him anymore. They'd already decided what he was. Dangerous, unsalvageable, not worth the effort. She knew exactly how that felt. But some boy... 3 days later, the gossip reached Margaret's classroom. She was teaching multiplication tables to the younger students when she heard two mothers talking outside the window, their voices carrying clearly through the thin walls. Did you hear about Ethan Mercer? The horse? Worse. Vernon Pike told him if he can't get control of his ranch, he should marry that schoolteacher to make himself look more respectable. Laughter, cruel and bright. Margaret Whitmore? Pike must be joking. He's not. He thinks a wife, any wife, will make Ethan look stable enough for the investors, and she's desperate enough to say yes to anything. More laughter. Margaret's hand tightened on the piece of chalk she was holding. It snapped. The students looked up. Continue your work, Margaret said calmly. I'll be right back. She walked outside, her footsteps deliberate and even. The two women stopped talking the moment they saw her. Miss Whitmore, one of them said nervously, we were just... I heard exactly what you were doing, Margaret said quietly. And I want you to understand something. I have never, in 17 years, asked this town for anything. Not sympathy, not charity, not a husband. I have earned my place here through my work. And if you think I am so desperate that I would marry a stranger just to stop being the subject of your gossip, then you understand nothing about me at all. She turned and walked back inside, closing the door firmly behind her. Her hands were shaking. She taught the rest of the day on pure will, smiling at students, correcting papers, acting as though nothing had happened. But when the last child left and the schoolhouse was empty, she sat down at her desk and let herself feel it. The humiliation, the anger, the bone-deep exhaustion of being the town's punchline. She was so tired, tired of being brave, tired of being dignified, tired of pretending that their words didn't cut her. But what choice did she have? Breaking down wouldn't change anything. It would only give them more ammunition. So she gathered her papers, locked the schoolhouse, and walked home through the freezing February twilight. She didn't see Ethan Mercer standing outside her house until she was almost at the door. He straightened when he saw her, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable and determined in equal measure. Miss Whitmore, he said, I need to talk to you. Margaret's stomach dropped. If this is about what Vernon Pike said, it's not. Not exactly. Ethan took a breath. It's about the horse. She stopped. The stallion? I've tried everything, every technique I know. I've had the best horseman in the territory look at him. Nothing works. He's getting worse, not better. And if I can't get him under control... He trailed off, jaw tight. The investors are pulling out. I'll lose the ranch. Margaret didn't know what to say. She felt genuinely sorry for him, but she had no idea why he was telling her this. What I saw the other day, Ethan continued, when you stood by the fence, he responded to you. For a second. That's a second more than he's given anyone else. Ethan's eyes were desperate now. Miss Whitmore, I know this is strange. I know you don't know me, but I'm asking, would you help me with the horse? Margaret stared at him. You're serious? Completely. I don't know anything about horses. You know something I don't. Please. I'm out of options. A dozen responses ran through Margaret's mind. No, absolutely not. This is ridiculous. I'm a schoolteacher, not a horse trainer. Find someone else. But what came out was, why me? Ethan met her eyes. Because that horse is scared, and you're the only person who looked at him and saw it. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. If I say yes, Margaret said slowly. It's not because of Vernon Pike's suggestion. It's not because I'm desperate or lonely or trying to get close to you. It's because that animal deserves better than what he's getting. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. And if this becomes town gossip, if people start saying things, I'm done. I walk away. Understood. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, searching for mockery or pity or any of the things she'd learned to recognize. She found none of it, just exhaustion and genuine need. All right, she said finally. I'll try. The relief on Ethan's face was almost painful to see. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Whitmore. Don't thank me yet. I might not be able to help at all. You already have, Ethan said quietly. You're the first person who didn't tell me to shoot him. He left, and Margaret went inside her small, cold house. She lit the lamp, made tea, sat at her table with her hands wrapped around the warm cup. What had she just agreed to? She had no idea how to train a horse, no idea if anything she tried would work, no idea if this would end in disaster or humiliation or both. But for the first time in 17 years, someone had asked her for help, not because she was useful in the background, but because she'd seen something no one else had. And despite everything, despite all the fear and doubt curling in her chest, that felt like something. Pasek. Margaret arrived at the Mercer Ranch before dawn the next morning. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through everything that could go wrong. But she'd made a promise, and Margaret Whitmore kept her promises. Ethan was waiting by the corral, looking almost as tired as she felt. You came, he said, and she heard the surprise in his voice. I said I would. The stallion stood in the center of the corral, head high, watching them. In the pale pre-dawn light, he looked almost mythical, a creature made of shadow and muscle and barely contained violence. What's his name? Margaret asked. The trader called him Midnight. I haven't called him anything. He needs a name. Ethan looked at her. What would you call him? Margaret studied the horse. Storm, because that's what he carries inside. Storm, Ethan repeated. All right. Margaret walked slowly to the fence. She didn't climb over, didn't try to enter the corral. She just stood there, hands resting lightly on the top rail. What are you doing? Ethan asked quietly. Letting him get used to me. That could take hours. Then it takes hours. Ethan fell silent. The sky lightened by degrees, black to gray to pale gold. The ranch came to life around them. Hands emerged from the bunkhouse, starting their morning work. Smoke rose from the main house chimney. Someone rang the breakfast bell. Margaret didn't move. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stallion's ears began to shift. Forward, curious. He's listening, Ethan whispered. He's always listening, Margaret murmured. The question is whether he feels safe enough to show it. Another 10 minutes passed. Then the horse took a step toward them. Just one. But it was voluntary, not driven by fear or aggression. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her breathing slow and even. Now what? Ethan asked. Now we wait some more. For what? For him to decide we're not a threat. The sun broke over the eastern mountains, flooding the corral with light. And in that moment, the stallion took another step forward. Then another. Margaret didn't reach out, didn't call to him, didn't make any sudden moves. The horse stopped 5 feet away, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Easy, Storm, Margaret said softly. Nobody's going to hurt you. His ears flicked at the sound of her voice. They stood like that, woman and horse, separated by 5 feet in an ocean of mistrust, while the ranch woke up around them. And then, so slowly she almost didn't see it happen, the stallion lowered his head. Just an inch, just enough. He's calming, Ethan breathed. Margaret nodded, not daring to speak louder. But the moment was fragile, and the world was full of things that could break it. A ranch hand dropped a bucket near the barn, the metal clanging loud against stone, and the spell shattered. Storm reared back, ears flat, and retreated to the far side of the corral. Margaret exhaled slowly. That's enough for today, she said. But he was right there, and he'll be there again tomorrow. Pushing now will undo everything. She turned to look at Ethan. This isn't going to be fast, you understand that? How long? I don't know. Weeks, maybe longer. Ethan's face was tight with worry. I don't have longer. The investors are coming back in 3 weeks. If I can't show them progress, if I can't prove the ranch is stable, they'll pull out. Then we'll do what we can in 3 weeks, Margaret said. But I won't rush him. Not for money. Not for anything. She expected him to argue, to tell her that business mattered more than a horse's feelings. That's what men did, in her experience. They prioritized results over compassion, always. But Ethan just nodded. All right, we do it your way. Margaret studied him for a moment, surprised. Why are you trusting me? Because everything else I've tried has failed. He smiled, and it was tired and genuine. And because you're the only person who's looked at Storm and seen something worth saving. The words hit her harder than she expected. Something worth saving. How long had it been since someone had said that about her? For the next 2 weeks, Margaret arrived at the ranch every morning before dawn and stayed until the sun was high. She brought a small stool and sat by the corral, reading aloud from books, while Storm paced and watched her. It felt absurd at first. She was reading Oliver Twist to a horse, while ranch hands snickered behind her back and the whole town whispered about the spinster who'd lost her mind. But Storm was listening. She could see it in the way his ears tracked her voice, the way he moved closer to her side of the corral each day, the way his breathing slowed when she read the quieter passages. Ethan watched from a distance, never interfering, but always present. Sometimes he brought her coffee. Sometimes he just sat on the fence and listened to her read. On the 10th day, Storm came close enough that Margaret could have touched him if she'd reached through the fence. She didn't reach. You're going to have to touch him eventually, Ethan said quietly. When he's ready. When will that be? When he decides. Ethan shook his head, but he was smiling. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met. Good, Margaret said. So is he. On the 15th day, Storm ate an apple from her hand through the fence rails. His lips were velvet soft against her palm, and when he crunched the fruit and looked at her with something that might have been gratitude, Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. You did it, Ethan said, his voice filled with wonder. We're not done yet, Margaret reminded him. He'll let me feed him. That doesn't mean he'll let you ride him. But it was progress, real, undeniable progress. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan looked like he might believe his ranch could be saved. The gossip, of course, got worse. Margaret heard it everywhere she went. The mercantile, the church, even from some of the older students who repeated what their parents said at home. She's trying to trap him. She thinks if she makes herself useful enough, he'll marry her. Desperate old maid. Margaret ignored it the way she'd always ignored it, with silence and dignity. But Ruth Ann Cooper pulled her aside after church one Sunday and said gently, Margaret, people are talking. Maybe you should, I don't know, take a step back from the ranch before this gets out of hand? What people say isn't my responsibility, Margaret replied. I'm helping with a horse, that's all. But it doesn't look like that to everyone. Then everyone needs to examine why they're so eager to turn a simple act of kindness into something ugly. Ruth Ann sighed. I'm just trying to protect you. I don't need protection. I need people to mind their own business. But the words hurt more than she wanted to admit, because part of her wondered if they were right. Not about trapping Ethan, she had no interest in marriage, certainly not one built on obligation, but about the futility of it all. What would happen when the horse was trained, when Ethan didn't need her anymore? Would she just go back to her small house and her quiet life and watch from a distance while he moved on? She tried not to think about it. On the 18th day, Vernon Pike arrived at the ranch with 3 other men in expensive coats. The investors, Ethan muttered to Margaret. They're early. Margaret's stomach dropped. Do you want me to leave? No, stay, please. Pike approached with his usual swagger, the other men following like well-dressed shadows. Mercer, Pike said, we're here to see this miraculous horse of yours, the one that's supposedly going to anchor your breeding program. He's not ready for a demonstration, Ethan said tightly. Not ready? One of the investors laughed. It's been almost a month, boy. Either you can handle your stock or you can't. I can handle him, but he's been traumatized. He needs... We don't have time for therapy sessions with livestock, Pike interrupted. Show us the horse. Now. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Margaret stood by the corral, her heart hammering. Storm was calmer than he'd been a month ago, yes. But he wasn't ready for this. Too many people, too much noise, too much pressure. Ethan entered the corral slowly, a lead rope in his hands. Storm's ears went flat immediately. "Easy, Storm," Ethan said quietly. "Easy, boy." The horse backed away, head high, eyes rolling. "This is your prize stallion," one of the investors said, laughing. "He's terrified of you. He's had a hard time adjusting." "He's worthless," Pike said flatly. "And so is this ranch, if this is the best you can do." Storm reared, hooves flashing, and Ethan had to scramble back to avoid being struck. The investors shook their heads, already turning away. "We're pulling out," Pike announced. "This is a disaster waiting to happen." "Wait," Margaret heard herself say. Everyone turned to look at her. "Who are you?" one of the investors asked dismissively. "Someone who knows more about that horse than any of you," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You want to see what he can do? Let me show you." Ethan's eyes went wide. "Margaret, you don't have to—" But she was already climbing over the fence. Her skirt caught on a rail, and she had to yank it free, tearing the fabric. She didn't care. She walked into the center of the corral, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Storm watched her, ears flicking nervously. "It's all right," Margaret said softly. "It's just me." Behind her she heard the investors muttering, heard Pike laugh. "This is your solution? A schoolteacher?" Margaret ignored them all. She walked slowly toward Storm, hands open and empty. The horse shifted, uncertain. "I know you're scared," Margaret murmured. "I know they're loud and they don't understand. But I'm here, and I won't let them hurt you." Storm's breathing slowed. Margaret stopped 10 feet away and simply stood there, the same way she had that first morning. Waiting. Patient. The seconds stretched out, and then Storm took a step toward her. The investors went silent. Another step. Another. Until the massive stallion stood directly in front of Margaret, his dark eyes locked on hers. Slowly, carefully, Margaret raised one hand. Storm's nostrils flared, his ears swiveled forward, and then he lowered his head and pressed his forehead gently against her palm. The watching men erupted in astonished murmurs. Margaret rested her hand on Storm's face, feeling the warmth of him, the trust in that simple gesture. "You see?" she said quietly, not to the horse but to the men watching. "He's not broken. He was never broken. You just had to give him a reason to trust you." She turned to look at Pike, at the investors, at all of them with their expensive clothes and their arrogant assumptions. "If you think this ranch is worthless because one horse needed patience instead of violence, then you're investing in the wrong things." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Then one of the investors, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, started to clap. "Well," he said, "that's the damnedest thing I've ever seen." Pike's face was red with fury, but he couldn't argue with what they'd all just witnessed. "We'll give you another month, Mercer," the gray-haired man said. "Get that horse fully trained and we'll talk about the investment again." "Thank you, sir," Ethan said, his voice rough. The men left, still talking amongst themselves. Margaret stood in the corral with Storm, her hand still resting on his face, and tried to remember how to breathe. Ethan climbed over the fence and walked to her slowly. "You saved it," he said. "You saved everything." "I didn't do anything," Margaret said. "Storm did all the work." "That's not true." Ethan's eyes were bright. "Margaret, But whatever he was going to say was cut off by Vernon Pike's voice, harsh and final. "This changes nothing about the real problem, Mercer." They turned. Pike stood outside the corral, arms crossed, face cold. "That horse might trust the schoolteacher, but the investors don't trust you. A single man with a failing ranch and a dangerous animal, that's not a solid investment. It's a liability." "I just showed you—" "You showed me that you need a woman to fix your problems," Pike interrupted, "which is exactly why I suggested you marry her in the first place." Margaret's blood went cold. "That's not what this is," Ethan said tightly. "Isn't it?" Pike's smile was cruel. "Face facts, Mercer. If you want your ranch to survive, you need to look respectable, stable. A wife would do that. And Miss Whitmore here is certainly available." The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt the humiliation crash over her in waves. She'd been useful, that's all, a tool to save a business deal. And now Pike was saying it out loud, stripping away any pretense that she mattered beyond her function. "Get out!" Ethan said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get off my land!" "Gladly." Pike tipped his hat with mock politeness. "But think about what I said. A month isn't long, and the investors won't wait forever." He left. Margaret stood frozen, unable to look at Ethan. "Margaret," he started. "I should go," she said quietly. "Please don't. He's wrong. You know he's wrong." "Do I?" Margaret finally met his eyes, and she was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Because from where I'm standing, Vernon Pike just said out loud what everyone's been thinking. I'm the solution to your problem. Marry the desperate spinster, and suddenly you look respectable enough for investors. That's not why I asked for your help." "I know. I believe that. But it doesn't change how this looks." She smiled, and it hurt. "I've spent 17 years being the woman nobody wanted, Ethan. I won't spend the rest of my life being the woman someone settled for." She climbed out of the corral, tore her skirt further on the fence, and didn't care. "Margaret, wait." But she was already walking away, back toward town, back toward her small safe house where no one could humiliate her anymore. Behind her, she heard Storm whinny, a sound almost like distress. She didn't turn around. That night, Margaret sat at her table and cried. Not delicate tears, not the kind of crying that made you look beautiful in novels. Ugly, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. She'd let herself hope. That was the worst part. For a few weeks, working with Storm, seeing Ethan's gratitude and respect, she'd let herself imagine that maybe she could be more than the town's punchline. Maybe she could be valued, seen. But Vernon Pike had reminded her of the truth. She was useful, that was all. And usefulness could be traded like any other commodity. A knock on the door made her freeze. "Miss Whitmore?" Ethan's voice, quiet through the wood. "Please, I need to talk to you." "Go away." "I will, after you hear me out." Margaret wiped her face roughly and opened the door just wide enough to see him. "What?" Ethan looked terrible, hair disheveled, face pale, eyes desperate. "Vernon Pike is wrong," he said, "about all of it. I didn't ask for your help because I thought it would make me look better. I asked because you were the only person who understood that horse. And these past weeks, working with you, it's been—" He stopped, struggling for words. "You're not a solution to my problems, Margaret. You're the first person in this whole damn town who's treated me like I might actually know what I'm doing." Margaret's throat was tight. "That doesn't change what people think." "I don't care what people think." "Yes, you do. You care about those investors. You care about saving your ranch. And if marrying me makes that easier, I would never ask that of you," Ethan said fiercely. "Never. You deserve so much more than being someone's convenience." The words broke something open in her chest. "Then what do you want from me?" she whispered. "I want—" Ethan took a breath. "I want you to come back tomorrow. Keep working with Storm. Not for the investors, not for the ranch, but because you're good at it. Because he trusts you. Because it matters." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She should say no. Protect herself. Walk away before this got more complicated. But Storm's face flashed through her mind. Those dark eyes. That gentle pressure of his forehead against her hand. "One condition," she said finally. "Anything. No more talk about marriage, no more suggestions from Pike or anyone else. I'm helping the horse, that's all." "Agreed. And if it becomes too much, if the gossip gets worse, I'm done." "Understood," Margaret nodded slowly. "Then I'll see you tomorrow morning." Relief flooded Ethan's face. "Thank you." He left, and Margaret closed the door. She sat back down at her table, exhausted and wrung out and still terrified of what all this meant. But Storm needed her, and maybe, for now, that was enough. The next morning arrived cold and merciless, the kind of February dawn that made your bones ache before you even left the house. Margaret dressed in the dark, her fingers clumsy with the buttons on her plainest work dress. She hadn't slept more than an hour, her mind replaying Vernon Pike's words on an endless, humiliating loop. "Miss Whitmore here is certainly available." She splashed frigid water on her face from the basin, trying to shock herself into something resembling composure. Her reflection in the small mirror looked tired. Older than 38, the kind of tired that came from carrying other people's judgments for too long. But she'd made a promise. The walk to the Mercer Ranch took 20 minutes through frozen mud and morning mist. Her breath came out in white clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, and the sound felt lonelier than silence. When she arrived, Ethan was already by the corral, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He looked as exhausted as she felt. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, offering her one of the cups. "No." They stood in silence for a moment, drinking coffee that was too hot and tasted faintly of tin. Storm paced the far edge of the corral, his dark shape barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. "I told the ranch hands to stay away this morning," Ethan said quietly. "Figured we could use the privacy." Margaret nodded, grateful. The last thing she needed was an audience. She set down her cup and walked to the fence. Storm's ears swiveled toward her immediately, and despite everything, she felt that same strange pull, the connection that made no logical sense but existed anyway. "Hey, Storm," she said softly. "Just me today." The stallion moved closer, his steps cautious but deliberate. When he reached the fence, he pushed his nose through the rails, breathing warm air against her outstretched palm. Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This, at least, was real, uncomplicated by gossip or expectations or humiliation. "Can I try something?" Ethan asked from behind her. She turned. He was holding a bridle, the leather worn but well kept. "It's too soon," Margaret said immediately. "I know. I'm not going to put it on him. I just want him to get used to seeing it, smelling it." Ethan's expression was earnest. "You said we have to go slow. This is slow," Margaret considered. "All right, but if he panics, we stop." "I know." Ethan climbed over the fence with careful, measured movements. Storm's head lifted, ears flicking nervously, but he didn't bolt. "Good boy," Margaret murmured. "It's okay." Ethan approached from the side, keeping his movements small and unthreatening. He held the bridle low, letting it hang loosely from his hand. Storm snorted, backing up a step. "Easy," Ethan said. His voice was different than it had been that first day in the corral, softer, more patient. Margaret wondered if he'd learned that from watching her, and the thought made something warm and uncomfortable shift in her chest. For long minutes, nothing happened. Ethan stood still. Storm watched him. Margaret stayed by the fence, ready to intervene if needed. Then, slowly, Storm stretched his neck forward and sniffed the bridle. "That's it," Ethan breathed. "See? Nothing scary." The horse's nostrils flared, testing the leather. His ears were forward now, curious instead of afraid. Margaret found herself smiling despite everything. "He's braver than he thinks he is." "Reminds me of someone else I know," Ethan said, not looking at her. The words landed between them, gentle and too honest. Margaret didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. They worked like that for another hour as the sun climbed higher and turned the frost to mud. Ethan would hold the bridle, let Storm investigate it, then back away. Over and over, building trust in tiny increments. By the time Margaret's students would be arriving at the schoolhouse, Storm was letting Ethan touch the bridle to his neck without flinching. "That's enough," Margaret said. "We don't want to push too hard." Ethan nodded and climbed back out of the corral. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and there was a lightness in his expression that hadn't been there before. "He's really doing it," Ethan said, something like wonder in his voice. "He's actually learning. He always could learn. You just had to speak his language." "We," Ethan corrected, "we had to speak his language." The distinction felt important, though Margaret wasn't sure why. She was about to leave when Ethan said, "Margaret, wait. There's something else." Her stomach tightened. "What?" "Vernon Pike came by last night, after I left your place." Ethan's jaw was tight. "He's spreading it around town that you and I are, that we're courting." Margaret's face went hot, then cold. "We're not. I know that. You know that. But Pike doesn't care about the truth. He cares about making me look stable for the investors." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I told him to stop. I told him if he kept talking, I'd withdraw from the cattle deal entirely, but he just laughed." "Of course he did." Margaret's voice was flat. "Men like Vernon Pike don't listen to threats from men like you. No offense." "None taken. It's true." Margaret looked at the ground, at her mud-stained boots, at anything but Ethan's face. "What do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing. I just wanted you to know so you're not blindsided when people start talking. He paused. Though I guess they're already talking. They've been talking for weeks, Margaret said quietly. About how I'm desperate. About how I'm using the horse to get close to you. About how pathetic it is that a woman my age would... She stopped, her throat closing around the words. Margaret. I should go. The children will be waiting. Let them wait. Ethan's voice was firm. You need to hear this. I don't think you're desperate. I don't think you're pathetic. I think you're the most capable person in this entire town, and the fact that they can't see that says everything about them and nothing about you. Margaret finally looked up at him. His face was open, sincere, and it made her want to cry and run away in equal measure. That's kind of you to say, she managed. It's not kindness, it's the truth. The moment stretched between them, fragile and strange. Then Margaret stepped back. I really do need to go. I know. Same time tomorrow? Yes. She walked away quickly, not trusting herself to say anything else. Behind her, she heard Storm whinny, a sound that had become familiar over the past weeks, a sound that felt almost like goodbye. The schoolhouse was already full of children when Margaret arrived, breathless and 15 minutes late. They looked up at her with curious faces, and she forced herself to smile. Apologies, I was delayed this morning. Please take out your readers. The day passed in the usual rhythm of lessons and recitations, but Margaret felt distant from all of it, like she was watching herself teach from somewhere outside her own body. At lunch, two of the older girls approached her desk. Miss Whitmore. The taller one, Sarah Mitchell, twisted her hands nervously. Is it true you're getting married? Margaret's heart sank. Where did you hear that? My mama said Mr. Pike told everyone at the Mercantile that you and Mr. Mercer are engaged. Your mama heard wrong, Margaret said firmly. I am not engaged to anyone. But you've been going to his ranch every morning, to help with a horse, that's all. The girls exchanged glances, clearly unconvinced. It's all right if you're getting married, Sarah said, trying to be kind. Everyone says you deserve to be happy. The pity in her voice was almost worse than mockery. Thank you, Sarah. Now back to your seats, please. The girls left, whispering to each other, and Margaret pressed her fingers to her temples. This was exactly what she'd feared. The story was already out of control, twisting into something she couldn't contain. By the time school ended, Margaret felt scraped raw. She walked home through the center of town, and the stairs followed her like physical weight. Women whispered behind their hands. Men smirked. Even the children seemed to be watching her differently. At the Mercantile, Clara Bennett made a point of intercepting her. Margaret, I heard the wonderful news. There is no news, Margaret said, trying to move past her. Clara blocked her path, all false sweetness. Oh, don't be modest. Vernon Pike himself said you and Ethan Mercer have an understanding. Vernon Pike is mistaken. Well, I suppose a woman in your position can't afford to be too choosy. Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes. Though I must say, I'm surprised Ethan would settle for... She caught herself. I mean, I'm sure you'll make him very comfortable. The word hung in the air like an insult. Margaret felt her composure crack. I'm not marrying Ethan Mercer, Clara, and even if I were, it wouldn't be any of your business. Now, if you'll excuse me. She pushed past, ignoring Clara's offended gasp. But the damage was done. By the time Margaret reached her house, she was shaking with anger and humiliation. She slammed the door behind her and stood in the middle of her small, cold room, fists clenched at her sides. This was impossible. She couldn't keep helping Ethan, not with the whole town turning their relationship into gossip fodder. It didn't matter that nothing was happening between them. It didn't matter that they were just training a horse. Perception was reality in a town like Red Hollow, and the perception was that she was a desperate spinster trying to trap a younger man. Margaret sat down at her table and put her head in her hands. She'd survived 17 years of this town's cruelty. She could survive this too, but she was so tired of surviving. A knock on the door made her freeze. Margaret? Ruth Ann's voice, gentle and worried. Can I come in? Margaret considered pretending she wasn't home, but Ruth Ann was persistent, and more importantly, she was one of the few people in town who'd never been deliberately cruel. It's open, Margaret called. Ruth Ann entered, carrying a covered basket. I brought you supper. Thought you might not feel like cooking tonight. That's kind of you. Ruth Ann set the basket on the table and sat down across from Margaret. Her face was troubled. I heard what Clara said to you. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for her. I know, but I'm sorry anyway. Ruth Ann hesitated. Margaret, is it true? About you and Ethan? No. But you've been spending time with him. I've been working with his horse. That's different. Is it? Ruth Ann's expression was sympathetic. Because from the outside, it doesn't look different, and I'm worried about you. Margaret laughed, but it came out bitter. Worried I'm making a fool of myself? Worried you're going to get hurt? Ruth Ann reached across the table and touched Margaret's hand. I know what it's like to want something you can't have. I know how easy it is to convince yourself that maybe this time will be different. I'm not convincing myself of anything, Margaret said. I'm helping a frightened animal, that's all. Are you sure? The question hit harder than it should have, because the truth was, Margaret wasn't sure. She wasn't sure what she felt when Ethan looked at her with respect instead of pity. She wasn't sure why her mornings at the ranch had become the only part of her day she looked forward to. She wasn't sure if the warmth in her chest when Storm pressed his head against her hand had anything to do with the horse or the man standing beside her. I need to be sure, Margaret said quietly, because I can't survive this town if I'm not. Ruth Ann squeezed her hand. Then maybe you should stop going to the ranch, at least for a while. Let the gossip die down. I made a promise. Promises can be broken when they start to hurt you. Margaret pulled her hand away. The horse needs me. And what about what you need? Margaret didn't have an answer for that. After Ruth Ann left, Margaret ate the supper she'd brought, stew that tasted like nothing, and tried to think clearly. She could stop going to the ranch. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But Storm trusted her now. He was making progress. And if she walked away just because people were gossiping, what did that say about her? That she was exactly as weak as they thought she was. No. Margaret stood up, her decision made. She would keep her promise. She would help Storm. And if the town wanted to talk, let them talk. She'd survived worse. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the ranch to find Ethan in an argument with one of his ranch hands. Don't care what Pike said, Ethan was saying, his voice tight with anger. You work for me, not him. I'm just saying, boss, maybe you should think about... I'm not thinking about anything except getting this ranch running properly. Now get back to work. The ranch hand left, shooting Margaret a curious look as he passed. Problems? Margaret asked. Ethan turned, and she saw the exhaustion in his face. Pike's been talking to my men, telling them the ranch is going under, that I'm too distracted with other things to run it properly. By other things, he means me. Yeah, Margaret set her jaw. Do you want me to stop coming? No. Ethan's answer was immediate and fierce. No, this is exactly what Pike wants. To drive a wedge between us so I'll be desperate enough to do whatever he says. I'm not giving him that satisfaction. Even if it costs you your ranch? Even then. They stared at each other for a long moment. You're stubborn, Margaret said finally. So are you. Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled. They worked with Storm for the next 2 hours, and for a while the rest of the world fell away. Ethan was getting better at reading the horse's signals, knowing when to push and when to back off. Storm was calmer, more trusting, less likely to spook at sudden movements. It was working. I think we could try the saddle tomorrow, Ethan said as they took a break. Just laying it on his back, not riding, just getting him used to the weight. That's a big step. I know, but he's ready. I can feel it. Margaret studied Storm, who was grazing peacefully at the far end of the corral. Maybe. Let's see how he is in the morning. Ethan nodded, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? All right. Why are you really doing this? Helping me, I mean. You don't owe me anything, and it's clearly making your life harder. Margaret considered her answer carefully. When I look at Storm, I see someone who was judged before anyone bothered to understand him. Someone who got labeled as broken because he didn't respond the way people expected. She paused. I know what that feels like. Ethan's expression softened. You're not broken, Margaret. I didn't say I was. I said, I know what it feels like to be seen that way. Well, for what it's worth, that's not how I see you. How do you see me? The question came out before she could stop it, too raw and too honest. Ethan met her eyes. I see someone who's stronger than anyone gives her credit for. Someone who's patient when the whole world is screaming for quick solutions. Someone who... He stopped, seeming to realize he was saying too much. Someone who what? Margaret's heart was beating too fast. Someone I'm grateful to know, Ethan finished quietly. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Margaret looked away first. I should go. The children will be waiting. Right, of course. She climbed over the fence, catching her skirt again on the rough wood. This time Ethan reached out to help free it, his hand brushing against hers. They both froze. Sorry, Ethan said, pulling back. It's fine. But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Margaret walked away quickly, her face burning. Behind her, she heard Storm's soft nicker, and it sounded almost like a question. The gossip reached a fever pitch over the next week. Someone, Margaret suspected Clara Bennett, started a rumor that Ethan had proposed and Margaret had accepted. Someone else claimed they'd seen the two of them kissing in the barn. A third person swore Margaret was already pregnant. None of it was true. All of it spread like wildfire. Margaret endured it the way she'd endured everything else, with silence and dignity. But it was getting harder. The stares were more blatant now, the whispers louder. Even some of her students started asking uncomfortable questions. Is Mr. Mercer handsome, Miss Whitmore? Are you going to have babies? My mama says you're too old for babies. Margaret deflected as best she could, but each question felt like a small cut. And then Vernon Pike showed up at the schoolhouse. It was Friday afternoon, and Margaret was cleaning the chalkboard when she heard the door open behind her. School's over for the day, she said without turning around. I'm not here for lessons. She spun. Pike stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, expression unreadable. What do you want? Margaret asked, her voice cold. To make you an offer. I'm not interested in anything you have to say. Pike smiled. You haven't heard it yet. I don't need to. Get out. Now, Miss Whitmore, there's no need for hostility. He stepped further into the room, and Margaret fought the urge to back away. I'm here to help you. Help me how? By offering you exactly what you want. A marriage proposal, security, a place in this community that doesn't involve being the subject of mockery. Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. You're not offering me anything. You're trying to manipulate Ethan. Is that so wrong? The boy needs stability. You need a husband. It's a practical solution. I don't need a husband. Don't you? Pike's eyes were sharp. You're 38 years old, Margaret. How many more chances do you think you'll get? The cruelty of it took her breath away. I'm not a commodity to be traded, she said, her voice shaking. And I won't let you use me to control Ethan. You think you're protecting him? You're the reason his ranch is falling apart. Every day you spend there, his reputation gets worse. The investors are laughing at him. His men are losing respect. All because he's too distracted by a spinster schoolteacher to focus on business. That's not true, isn't it? Face facts, Margaret. You're a liability. The best thing you could do for Ethan Mercer is marry him quickly and quietly, give him the appearance of respectability, and then stay out of his way. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Get out of my classroom. Think about what I'm saying. Get out! Pike studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. Suit yourself. But when that boy loses everything because of you, remember I tried to help. He left. Margaret stood alone in the empty schoolhouse, shaking. Was Pike right? Was she the reason Ethan's ranch was struggling? If she stopped going, would his life get easier? She didn't know. She didn't know anything anymore. That night, Margaret made a decision. She sat at her table and wrote a letter to Ethan. Her handwriting was usually neat, but tonight the words came out jagged and uneven. Ethan, I can't keep coming to the ranch. Vernon Pike came to see me today, and he made it clear that my presence is hurting your business. I don't know if he's right, but I can't risk it. Storm is doing well. He's ready for the saddle. You can take it from here without me. I'm sorry. Margaret. She read it over 3 times, hating every word. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the table, planning to deliver it in the morning. But sleep wouldn't come. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. She thought about Storm's dark eyes, about the way he'd learned to trust, about the quiet mornings by the corral that had become the only peace she'd known in years. She thought about Ethan's voice when he said she was stronger than anyone gave her credit for, and she thought about Vernon Pike's cruel smile. Somewhere around midnight, Margaret got out of bed, walked to the table, and tore the letter into pieces. She wouldn't run. Not from gossip, not from Pike, not from her own fear. If Ethan wanted her gone, he could tell her himself. But she wouldn't make that decision for him based on a bully's threats. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the ranch just as the sun was breaking over the mountains. Ethan was already there, sitting on the fence with his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard her approach, and the relief on his face was unmistakable. "You came," he said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "Pike told me he talked to you. I thought—" Ethan stopped. "I thought maybe he'd convinced you to leave." "He tried, but you're here anyway." "I'm here anyway." Ethan climbed down from the fence and walked toward her. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Her stomach dropped. "What?" "The investors are coming back next week. Pike's bringing them to see Storm, to see if the ranch is worth their money." He took a breath. "If Storm isn't ready, if I can't prove I can handle him, I lose everything." "I know, but that's not what I need to tell you." Ethan's eyes were serious. "What I need to tell you is that even if I lose the ranch, even if everything falls apart, I don't regret asking for your help. Working with you these past weeks has been—" He struggled for words. "It's been the best part of my day. Every day. And I needed you to know that." Margaret's throat was tight. "Ethan, I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not proposing marriage or trying to trap you into some arrangement. I just needed you to know that you matter, to me. Not because you're useful, not because you can fix my problems, but because you're you." The words hung in the cold morning air. Margaret didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the way her heart was hammering in her chest, so instead she turned toward the corral. "Let's try the saddle." Ethan blinked, clearly thrown by the subject change. "Right, yes. The saddle." They worked in careful silence, each movement deliberate and slow. Ethan brought out his best saddle, worn leather, well-oiled, not too heavy. Storm sniffed it cautiously, ears flicking. "Easy, boy," Margaret murmured. "It's just a thing. It can't hurt you." Ethan lifted the saddle slowly, letting Storm see it, smell it, get used to its presence. Then, with movements so gradual they were almost imperceptible, he laid it gently on Storm's back. The horse froze. Margaret held her breath. Storm's muscles tensed, his head lifted. For a terrible moment she thought he was going to bolt, but then he let out a long, shuddering breath and stood still. "Good boy," Ethan breathed. "Good boy, Storm." They left the saddle there for 30 seconds. Then Ethan carefully lifted it off. Storm shook his mane and snorted, but he didn't panic. "He did it," Ethan said, and his voice was full of wonder. "He actually did it." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "He's braver than he knows." "So are you," Ethan said quietly. Their eyes met across the corral, and in that moment Margaret realized with absolute terrifying clarity that Vernon Pike had been wrong about one thing. She wasn't a liability to Ethan Mercer. She was falling in love with him. The thought should have scared her, should have sent her running. But standing there in the cold morning light, watching Storm graze peacefully with the memory of the saddle still fresh, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 17 years. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, impossible hope. And she had no idea what to do with it. Margaret spent the rest of that day in a fog. She taught her lessons by rote, corrected papers without really seeing them, and answered questions with half her mind somewhere else entirely. The realization sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable and absolutely terrifying. She was falling in love with Ethan Mercer. No, that wasn't quite right. The falling part was already over. She'd landed somewhere along the way without noticing, and now she was standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what it meant. It meant disaster, probably. It meant heartbreak. It meant being even more vulnerable than she already was in a town that had spent 17 years teaching her exactly how little mercy to expect. When the last student left, Margaret sat at her desk and pressed her palms flat against the scarred wood, trying to ground herself in something solid. You're being ridiculous, she said aloud to the empty room. He's grateful. That's all. Grateful and desperate, and you're confusing kindness for something it's not. But his voice echoed in her memory anyway. You matter to me. Not because you're useful, not because you can fix my problems, but because you're you. Margaret stood abruptly, gathering her things with sharp, angry movements. She needed to get home, needed to think, needed to put distance between herself and these feelings before they swallowed her whole. She was halfway down the road when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Ethan rode up on one of his ranch horses, not Storm, but a calm gray mare, and pulled to a stop beside her. Need a ride? He asked. I can walk. I know you can. I'm offering anyway. He extended his hand down to her. Margaret looked at that hand, work roughened, scarred across the knuckles, steady, and knew she should refuse, knew that accepting would only make everything harder. She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. The mare started forward at an easy walk, and Margaret had to wrap her arms around Ethan's waist to keep her balance. She could feel the warmth of him through his shirt, the rise and fall of his breathing. Storm did well today, Ethan said after a moment. Better than I expected. He's ready for more. Think he'll let me ride him by the time the investors come? Margaret considered. Maybe, if we don't rush him. They rode in silence for a while. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that hurt to look at. Beautiful and temporary, like everything else. Margaret, Ethan said quietly, can I ask you something? Her arms tightened around him involuntarily. All right. Why did you never marry? I know that's a rude question, but... He paused. You could have. You're smart. You're kind. You're... He stopped again, seeming to struggle with the words. I just don't understand why you're alone. Margaret's throat went tight. No one ever asked. I find that hard to believe. Believe it anyway. I wasn't pretty enough to inspire passion, and I wasn't meek enough to inspire whatever it is men want in a wife. Obedience, I suppose. So I fell through the cracks. She tried to keep her voice light, matter of fact. It's not tragic. It just is. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I think anyone who overlooked you was a fool. The words hit her like a physical blow. Don't, she said, and her voice came out harsher than she intended. Don't say things like that. Why not? Because it's not fair. What's not fair about it? You're being kind because I helped you, because you feel grateful, but kindness isn't... She stopped, not trusting herself to continue. Ethan pulled the mare to a halt. They were still a quarter mile from Margaret's house, surrounded by empty fields and fading light. You think I'm saying these things out of gratitude? He twisted in the saddle to look at her, his face serious. Margaret, I'm saying them because they're true. You don't know me well enough to know if they're true. I know you better than you think. Margaret slid off the horse, needing distance. Her feet hit the ground harder than she expected, jarring her knees. You know the version of me that shows up to help with a horse. That's all. Ethan dismounted and stood facing her. So tell me the rest. There is no rest. This is all I am. A schoolteacher who lives alone and reads books and has conversations with a horse because it's easier than talking to people who've already decided what I am. And what have they decided you are? Someone not worth choosing. The words came out raw and too honest, and Margaret immediately regretted them. Ethan stepped closer. They're wrong. Are they? Because from where I'm standing, the evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence suggests this town is full of people who can't see past their own narrow expectations. His voice was fierce now. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who had every reason to become bitter and didn't. Someone who could have walked away from Storm when the gossip started but stayed anyway. Someone who... Stop, Margaret said. Please stop. Why? Because I can't... Her voice broke. I can't let myself believe you mean any of this. Because in 3 weeks the investors will come, and Storm will be trained, and you won't need me anymore. And I'll go back to being exactly what I was before. Except now I'll have to live with knowing what it felt like to be seen differently. And I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. The silence that followed was crushing. Then Ethan said quietly, What if I still need you after the investors come? Margaret's heart stuttered. For what? For... He stopped, seemed to reconsider. For help with the horses. Storm won't be the only one. There'll be others that need... Don't. Margaret's voice was steady now, cold. Don't offer me charity disguised as employment. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? She met his eyes. You're a kind man, Ethan. Too kind, maybe. But I won't be your project after Storm is fixed. I won't be the broken thing you feel obligated to keep around. You're not broken. Then stop trying to fix me. She turned and walked toward her house, leaving Ethan standing in the road with the mare's reins in his hand. She didn't look back. The week that followed was the longest of Margaret's life. She continued going to the ranch each morning because she'd promised and because Storm still needed her. But the easy companionship between her and Ethan had fractured into something careful and strained. They were polite to each other, professional, and it felt like dying by inches. Storm, oblivious to the tension, continued to improve. By Wednesday, he was letting Ethan ride him around the corral at a walk. By Friday, they managed a trot without incident. He's ready, Margaret said on Saturday morning, watching Storm respond to Ethan's commands with something close to grace. The investors will be impressed. Will you be here when they come? Ethan asked. Margaret hadn't planned on it. The thought of standing there while Vernon Pike and his wealthy friends evaluated Ethan like livestock made her sick. I don't think that's a good idea. I want you there. It'll just give people more to talk about. I don't care what people say anymore. Ethan rode Storm over to where Margaret stood by the fence. The stallion was breathing easy, ears forward, completely calm. None of this would have happened without you. You deserve to be there when it pays off. I don't need credit. Maybe not, but I need you there anyway. He paused. Please. Margaret looked up at him, at the earnest expression on his face, and felt her resolve crumbling. All right, I'll come. Thank you. That night, Vernon Pike showed up at Margaret's door. She'd been preparing for bed when she heard the knock, sharp and insistent. When she opened the door and saw Pike standing there with two of his ranch hands behind him, her blood went cold. Miss Whitmore, Pike said, tipping his hat in mock politeness. We need to talk. It's late. This won't take long. He pushed past her into the house without waiting for an invitation. Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. Get out. In a minute, Pike looked around her small room with obvious disdain. This is it? This is where the great schoolteacher lives? What do you want, Pike? He turned to face her, all pretense of civility gone. I want you to understand something. The investors are coming on Monday, and when they arrive, you will not be there. Ethan asked me to come. I don't care what Ethan asked. You've done enough damage to that boy's reputation. The last thing he needs is his spinster nursemaid standing around making him look weak. Margaret's face burned. I'm not his nursemaid? No. Then what are you? His lover? Pike's smile was cruel. We both know that's not true. You're nothing to him except a temporary solution to a problem. And once that problem is solved, you'll go back to being nothing to everyone. Get out of my house. Gladly, but hear me first. Pike stepped closer, and Margaret fought the urge to back away. If you show up at that ranch on Monday, I will make sure every person in this town knows exactly what kind of woman you are. A desperate, pathetic creature who threw herself at a man young enough to be ashamed of her. I've never thrown myself at anyone. Truth doesn't matter. Only what people believe. His eyes were cold. And they'll believe me, Margaret. They always do. The ranch hands behind him shifted uncomfortably, but neither of them spoke up. Margaret's voice shook, but she kept it steady. I'm not afraid of you. Then you're a fool. Pike headed for the door, then paused. Monday morning, stay away, or I'll destroy what's left of your reputation so thoroughly that you'll have to leave Red Hollow entirely, and we both know you have nowhere else to go. He left, his men following. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her whole body trembling. He was right about one thing. She had nowhere else to go. No family in other towns, no savings to start over somewhere new. Red Hollow was all she had, and Vernon Pike could absolutely make her life unbearable if he wanted to. She should stay away on Monday. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But the thought of Ethan standing there alone, with Pike taking credit for Storm's transformation, made her stomach turn. Margaret walked to her window and looked out at the dark, empty street. 17 years she'd been safe. 17 years she'd chosen dignity over defiance, silence over confrontation. And where had it gotten her? She was still alone, still mocked, still invisible except when people needed someone to pity or judge. Maybe it was time to stop being safe. Sunday dawned gray and threatening, the kind of day that promised snow but hadn't quite committed to it yet. Margaret went to church out of habit more than faith, sitting in her usual spot at the back while the congregation pretended not to stare at her. Ethan was there too, several rows ahead. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the pew in front of him. Vernon Pike sat in the front row, of course, surrounded by his family and his wealth and his absolute certainty that the world would bend to his will. The sermon was about forgiveness, which felt like a cruel joke. Afterward, as people filed out into the cold morning air, Clara Bennett made a point of intercepting Margaret. "I heard the most interesting thing," Clara said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "About tomorrow's meeting with the investors." "Did you?" "Vernon Pike told me you won't be attending. Said it wouldn't be appropriate." Clara's eyes gleamed with malice. "I suppose that makes sense. It is a business matter, after all. Not really your place." Margaret felt the words like a slap, but she kept her expression neutral. "We'll see." "Oh dear. You're not actually planning to show up, are you, after everything Vernon said?" Clara leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "He told the whole town what you've been doing, throwing yourself at that poor boy. It's embarrassing, Margaret, truly." Something inside Margaret snapped. She'd been silent for 17 years. She'd endured mockery and pity and judgment with her head held high and her mouth shut. But she was done. "You know what's embarrassing, Clara?" Margaret said, her voice quiet but cutting. "The fact that you're so threatened by a woman trying to help someone that you have to tear her down to feel better about yourself. The fact that you've spent your entire life defining your worth by who you married instead of who you are. The fact that you're standing here on a Sunday morning, fresh from a sermon about forgiveness, spreading gossip like it's your purpose on this earth." Clara's face went pale, then red. "How dare you?" "I dare because I have nothing left to lose." Margaret stepped closer. "You've already taken everything from me that you could. My reputation, my dignity, my peace. But you can't take tomorrow. That's mine. And I'm going to be there whether Vernon Pike likes it or not." She walked away, leaving Clara sputtering in the churchyard. Her hands were shaking, but she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Ethan caught up with her halfway down the road. "Margaret, wait." She turned. He looked worried and impressed in equal measure. "I heard what you said to Clara Bennett." "Half the town probably heard it." "Good." A smile flickered across his face. "She deserved it." "Maybe. But I just made everything worse for you." "You stood up for yourself. That's not making things worse." Ethan studied her face. "Pike talked to you, didn't he? Told you not to come tomorrow." Margaret didn't see the point in lying. "Yes." "And you're coming anyway." "Yes. Even though it'll make things harder for you." "Especially because of that." Margaret met his eyes. "I'm tired of being afraid, Ethan. I'm tired of hiding, and I'm tired of letting men like Vernon Pike decide what I'm worth." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Admiration, maybe, or something deeper. "I'm glad you're coming," he said quietly. "Not because I need you there for the horse. Storm will do fine either way, but because I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because I want you there. For me." Margaret's breath caught. "Ethan, I know what you said last week about not wanting to be my project, and I understand that. But you need to understand something too." He stepped closer. "This hasn't been about the horse for a long time. Maybe it never was." "Don't say that." "Why not? It's true." "Because it can't be true," Margaret said, and she hated how her voice shook. "Because you're 30 years old, and you have your whole life ahead of you, and I'm 38. I know. You've mentioned it approximately 24 times, like it's supposed to matter to me. It should matter. Well, it doesn't." Ethan's jaw was set, stubborn. "Do you want to know what does matter? The fact that you're the first person in this town who's ever treated me like I might actually know what I'm doing. The fact that you see things no one else sees. The fact that when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm drowning under everything I'm supposed to be." Margaret stared at him, her heart hammering. You're grateful. That's all this is. You're grateful and it's confusing your feelings. Stop telling me what I feel. Someone has to, because you're clearly not thinking straight. I'm thinking perfectly straight, Ethan said. Maybe for the first time in my life. They stood in the middle of the empty road, the wind picking up around them, carrying the promise of snow. This is a mistake, Margaret said finally. Probably. The whole town will talk. Let them. Vernon Pike will make your life hell. He already is. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Margaret, I'm not asking you to marry me. I'm not asking you for anything except, he paused, except maybe a chance to see if this thing between us is real. And what if it's not? Then at least we'll know. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. But I think it is. I think you know it too, and it scares you. He was right, and that terrified her more than anything Pike could threaten. I need time to think, Margaret said. Take all the time you need. Just be there tomorrow, please. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Ethan squeezed her hand once, then let go and walked back toward the church where his horse was tied. Margaret continued home, her mind spinning. Everything was happening too fast. The investors tomorrow. Pike's threats. Ethan's confession. Her own impossible, terrifying feelings. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step would send her tumbling into empty air. That night, Margaret barely slept. She lay in bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, playing out every possible version of tomorrow in her mind. In some versions, the meeting with the investors went perfectly. Storm performed beautifully. Ethan secured his funding, and Margaret slipped away quietly, back to her small life, leaving him to build his future without the weight of her presence. In other versions, Pike made good on his threats. He humiliated her in front of everyone, spread lies so vicious that she had to leave Red Hollow entirely, and Ethan stood by, helpless to stop it, watching her be destroyed. And in one version, the most dangerous one, the one she kept trying not to think about, Ethan meant what he'd said. The thing between them was real, and maybe, just maybe, she deserved to find out what that meant. By the time dawn broke, Margaret had made her decision. She dressed in her best dress, a simple gray wool that was only a few years old, mended carefully at the seams. She pinned her hair up with more care than usual. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw a woman who was tired and scared and absolutely done running. Then she walked to the Mercer Ranch. The sun was just breaking over the mountains when she arrived. Ethan was already in the yard talking with one of his hands. When he saw her, his whole face changed. "You came," he said, and the relief in his voice was almost painful. "I said I would." "I know, but after yesterday I thought—" "I'm here," Margaret interrupted. "That's what matters." Ethan smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face in days. Storm was in the corral, already saddled, looking calm and almost regal in the early morning light. Margaret walked over to him, and the stallion immediately came to the fence, pressing his nose against her hand. "Hey, beautiful boy," she murmured. "Big day today. You ready to show everyone what you can do?" Storm snorted softly, as if he understood. "He knows something's different," Ethan said, coming to stand beside her. "He's been restless all morning. He's feeding off your nerves." "I'm not nervous." "You're terrified. So is he." Margaret glanced at Ethan. "But you'll both be fine." "How do you know?" "Because you've done the work. Both of you. The rest is just performance." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Storm graze. Then hoofbeats sounded from the road, and Margaret's stomach dropped. The investors were early. Vernon Pike rode at the head of the group, 4 men in expensive coats, their horses sleek and well-fed. They pulled to a stop in the yard, surveying the ranch with expressions that ranged from curious to dismissive, and when Pike's eyes landed on Margaret, his face went hard with fury. "What is she doing here?" he demanded. "Miss Whitmore is here at my invitation," Ethan said firmly. "Your invitation?" Pike dismounted, his movements sharp with anger. "We discussed this, Mercer. This is a business meeting, not a social call. Margaret helped train Storm. She has every right to be here. She has no rights here at all." Pike turned to the other investors. "Gentlemen, I apologize. This is exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior I was trying to prevent." One of the investors, The gray-haired man who'd clapped for Margaret weeks ago spoke up. I don't see the problem, Vernon. If the lady helped with the horse, she should see the results. The problem, Pike said coldly, is that she's a distraction, and distractions are bad for business. I'm standing right here, Margaret said quietly. If you have something to say about me, say it to my face. Pike's smile was ugly. All right, you're a spinster schoolteacher who's been throwing herself at a man young enough to be your son. You've made yourself the laughingstock of this town, and now you're here trying to take credit for work you didn't do. Is that clear enough? The words hung in the cold morning air. Margaret felt every eye on her, the investors, the ranch hands, Ethan, felt the weight of 17 years of mockery and judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She could leave, walk away, let Pike have his victory, or she could stand her ground. I haven't thrown myself at anyone, Margaret said, her voice steady. I came here to help a frightened horse because I was asked. I stayed because the work mattered. And if you want to call that desperation, that says far more about you than it does about me. How dare! I'm not finished. Margaret stepped forward, and Pike actually took a step back. You talk about distractions and professionalism, but the truth is you're terrified. Terrified that Ethan might succeed without your help. Terrified that a woman you've spent years ignoring might actually know something you don't. Terrified that your money and your power don't matter as much as you think they do. Pike's face was purple with rage. You? Enough, the gray-haired investor said sharply. Pike, that's enough. Let's see the horse. Pike opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He shot Margaret a look of pure venom before turning to Ethan. Fine. Show us this miracle animal of yours. Ethan met Margaret's eyes for just a second, grateful, worried, determined, then walked to the corral. Storm was waiting, and Margaret stood at the fence, refusing to look away, refusing to hide. Whatever happened next, she would face it standing up. Ethan climbed into the corral with movements that were careful but not hesitant. Storm watched him approach, ears forward, completely calm. The contrast to that first day, when the stallion had been a whirlwind of panic and rage, was so stark it felt like looking at a different animal entirely. Easy, Storm, Ethan said quietly, though the horse didn't need the reassurance. Storm stood still as Ethan gathered the reins, placed his foot in the stirrup, and swung himself into the saddle. For a moment, nothing happened. Horse and rider simply stood there, breathing in sync. Then Ethan gave the gentlest pressure with his knees, and Storm began to walk. Margaret watched from the fence, her hands gripping the top rail so hard her knuckles went white. Around her, she could hear the investors murmuring to each other, could feel Vernon Pike's fury radiating like heat. Ethan guided Storm through a series of easy turns, then asked for a trot. The stallion responded immediately, his gait smooth and controlled. No fighting, no fear, just a horse who'd learned to trust the man on his back. Well, I'll be damned, one of the investors said. Pike, you said this animal was untamable. He was, Pike said tightly. A month ago, he was dangerous. And now he's not. The gray-haired man turned to Ethan. What changed? Ethan brought Storm to a halt in the center of the corral. We changed our approach, stopped trying to break him, and started trying to understand him. We? Pike's voice was sharp. Ethan looked directly at Margaret. Miss Whitmore saw what no one else could see. That Storm wasn't vicious, he was terrified. And she taught me how to work with that instead of against it. A schoolteacher taught you how to train horses? One of the other investors sounded skeptical. She taught me how to listen, Ethan corrected. The rest followed. Margaret felt her face flush, but she didn't look away. The gray-haired investor walked closer to the fence, studying Storm with obvious interest. Can you make him run? Yes, sir. Show me. Ethan gathered the reins, and Margaret saw him take a breath. This was the part they hadn't really practiced, a full gallop in front of strangers. Storm had been calm at a walk and trot, but asking for speed was asking him to trust on an entirely different level. It's all right, Margaret called out before she could stop herself. He's ready, Ethan nodded, then squeezed with his legs. Storm exploded into muscle motion. It wasn't the panicked, wild running of a frightened animal. It was pure power, controlled and magnificent. Storm's hooves thundered against the frozen ground as he raced around the corral, mane flying, muscles bunching and releasing with each stride. and Ethan rode him like they'd been partners for years. The investors erupted into a mazed conversation. Even Pike looked stunned, though he was clearly trying to hide it. Ethan brought Storm back down to a trot, then a walk, then a halt. The stallion was breathing hard but not distressed. His ears were still forward, his eyes bright. Ethan dismounted and ran a hand down Storm's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, utterly calm. "Gentlemen," the gray-haired investor said, "I've seen enough. This is exactly the kind of stock we need for a serious breeding program." He turned to Ethan. "Consider your funding approved, Mr. Mercer." Ethan's face went slack with shock. "Sir, I thank you. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank whoever taught you that patience matters more than force." The man's eyes shifted to Margaret. "Ma'am, that was remarkable work." Margaret didn't know what to say. She managed a nod. Pike's expression was murderous. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should discuss the details inside, away from—" He gestured vaguely toward Margaret. "Actually," the gray-haired man said, "I'd like to speak with Miss Whitmore. If she's responsible for this transformation, I want to understand her methods." "Her methods?" Pike's laugh was harsh. "She's a schoolteacher, not a horse trainer. And yet she accomplished what your expensive trainers couldn't." The investor walked over to Margaret, extending his hand. "James Crawford, ma'am. I'm genuinely impressed." Margaret shook his hand, still trying to process what was happening. "I didn't do anything special, just paid attention." "That's more special than you think." Crawford turned back to the group. "Mr. Mercer, I'd like to propose something. We'll fund your breeding program as discussed, but I'd also like to hire Miss Whitmore as a consultant. We've got several difficult horses at our ranch in Helena that could benefit from her approach." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "I'm not—" Margaret started. "I don't know anything about horses. Not really." "You know enough to fix what everyone else gave up on," Crawford said. "That's exactly what we need." Vernon Pike stepped forward, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is absurd. She's a schoolteacher. She has no credentials, no experience, no—" "She has results," Crawford interrupted, "which is more than I can say for the so-called experts we've been using." He looked at Margaret. "Think about it, ma'am. The pay would be substantial. 3 times what you're making now, I'd wager." Margaret's mind was spinning. 3 times her teaching salary, the chance to work with horses, to do something that mattered in a way that felt real and immediate. But it would mean leaving Red Hollow, leaving her students, leaving everything familiar, even if familiar meant lonely, leaving Ethan. "I need time to consider," she heard herself say. "Of course, take a week. Send word to the Crawford Ranch in Helena when you've decided." He tipped his hat. "I hope you'll say yes." The investors began discussing contract details with Ethan, their voices fading into background noise as Margaret tried to steady her breathing. She'd come here expecting humiliation, possibly disaster. She hadn't expected an escape route. Vernon Pike appeared beside her suddenly, his voice low and vicious. "You think you've won something here? You think this changes anything?" Margaret looked at him steadily. "I think it changes everything. Enjoy it while it lasts, because the moment you leave for Helena, if you leave, Mercer will forget you existed. Men like him don't pine for women like you." The words stung, but Margaret didn't flinch. "Is that really what scares you, Pike? That I might leave? Or that I might stay?" His face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, Ethan called out, "Margaret, can you come here for a minute?" She walked away from Pike without another word. Ethan stood by the corral with the investors, and when she approached, he was smiling, a real, unguarded smile that made him look younger than his 30 years. "They want to finalize the contracts next week," he said. "The ranch is saved." "I'm glad," Margaret said, and meant it. "This is because of you. This is because you did the work. We did the work." Ethan's eyes were bright. "Margaret, about Crawford's offer—" "Not now," she said quietly. Let's get through today first." He nodded, though she could see the question in his expression, the worry. The investors left shortly after, taking Vernon Pike with them. Pike shot Margaret one last poisonous look before mounting his horse, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too full of impossible choices. When the yard was finally quiet again, Ethan turned to her. "Walk with me?" They left the corral and headed toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The sky was still heavy with the promise of snow, the air sharp and cold. "You're thinking about taking Crawford's offer," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what I'm thinking. It's a good opportunity, better than anything Red Hollow could offer you." "Yes." They walked in silence for a while, their boots crunching on frozen grass. "I don't want you to go," Ethan said finally. Margaret stopped walking. "Ethan, I know I have no right to ask you to stay. I know we've barely—" He stopped, struggling with the words. "I know this is complicated and probably crazy, and you have every reason to take that job and never look back. Then why are you asking?" "Because I'm selfish." He turned to face her fully. "Because the thought of you leaving makes me feel like I can't breathe. Because these past weeks, working with you, they've been the best part of every day, and I know that's not fair to you, and I know I'm being a—" "Stop," Margaret said. Her voice was shaking. "Just stop. I can't. Not until you understand." "I do understand. That's the problem." She took a breath. "Do you know what it's like to spend 17 years invisible? To watch every other woman in this town get chosen while you stand on the sidelines pretending it doesn't matter? Do you know what it's like to finally have someone see you and not know if it's real or if you're just so desperate you're imagining it?" "It's real," Ethan said fiercely. "How do I know that? How do I know you're not just grateful or lonely or—" "Because I'm terrified," he interrupted. "Because I've never felt this way about anyone. Because when you're not here, everything feels harder and grayer, and I can't stop thinking about when I'll see you again. That's how you know it's real." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I'm 38 years old. I know. I'm not beautiful. You're wrong about that. The whole town thinks I'm pathetic. The whole town is wrong about a lot of things." Ethan stepped closer. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to marry me today. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm just asking—" He paused. "Don't leave because you think I don't want you here. Don't leave because you're scared of what this might be. What if I leave because it's the smart choice? Then I'll understand, but I'll still miss you every day for the rest of my life." The words hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. At the man who'd asked for her help when he was desperate, who'd listened when she spoke, who'd stood beside her when the whole town was whispering, who'd somehow, impossibly, seen past everything she'd been taught to hate about herself. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to figure out what I actually want instead of what I think I should want." "How much time?" "I don't know. A few days, maybe?" Ethan nodded, though she could see the effort it took. "All right, take whatever time you need." They walked back to the ranch in silence. When they reached the yard, Ethan squeezed her hand once, quick and almost desperate, then let go. "Thank you," he said, "for today, for everything." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice, and headed home. The walk back to town felt longer than usual. Every step was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Stay in Red Hollow with Ethan and all the terrifying uncertainty that came with it, or take Crawford's offer and build a new life somewhere no one knew her as the spinster schoolteacher. Both options felt like leaping off a cliff. One just had a clearer landing spot. When Margaret reached her house, Ruth Ann was waiting on her doorstep. "I heard what happened," Ruth Ann said. "The whole town's talking about it." "Of course they are." "Margaret, is it true? Did James Crawford really offer you a job?" "Yes." Ruth Ann's face lit up. "That's wonderful. When do you leave?" "I haven't decided if I'm going." "What do you mean you haven't decided? This is your chance to get out of here, to start fresh somewhere new. You'd be crazy not to take it." Margaret unlocked her door and went inside. Ruth Ann followed. "It's not that simple," Margaret said. "Why not? What's keeping you here? The children? They'll get a new teacher. The town? They barely appreciate you anyway." Ruth Ann paused. "Unless it's Ethan, isn't it?" Margaret didn't answer. "Oh, Margaret," Ruth Ann's voice was gentle. "You're really falling for him." "I don't know what I'm doing," Margaret admitted. "I don't know if what I feel is real or if I've been alone for so long, Ruth Ann. How do I know the difference between love and loneliness?" "You don't. Not for certain. That's what makes it terrifying." Ruth Ann sat down at the table. "But I'll tell you this. I've watched you for 17 years, and I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at Ethan Mercer. That has to mean something. It means I'm in over my head, maybe. Or maybe it means you finally found someone worth the risk. Margaret sat down across from her. What if I stay and it doesn't work out? What if I give up this opportunity and 6 months from now, Ethan realizes he made a mistake? What if you leave and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Neither option felt safe. I wish someone would just tell me what to do, Margaret said quietly. No, you don't. You've spent your whole life doing what other people expected. Maybe it's time to do what you actually want. Ruth Ann reached across the table and took her hand. What do you want, Margaret? Not what's smart, not what's safe. What do you actually want? Margaret closed her eyes. She wanted to wake up and not feel alone. She wanted someone to share breakfast with, someone to talk to about the day's small frustrations and victories. She wanted Storm's warm breath on her palm and Ethan's rare, genuine smiles. She wanted to stop being careful and controlled and start being reckless and alive. She wanted to stay. But wanting something didn't make it safe, didn't guarantee it would work out, didn't protect her from the very real possibility that this would all end in heartbreak. I want to stop being afraid, Margaret said finally. Then stay, or go. Just don't make the choice out of fear. After Ruth Ann left, Margaret sat alone in her small house and tried to think clearly. Helena meant safety, a fresh start. No more gossip, no more pitying looks, no more being the cautionary tale. But it also meant leaving behind the first person who'd ever made her feel like she mattered for who she was, not what she could provide. She spent the evening pacing, making lists of pros and cons that all felt meaningless, trying to logic her way through a decision that had nothing to do with logic. By the time she finally went to bed, she still didn't know what she was going to do. The next 3 days passed in a blur of indecision. Margaret taught her classes on autopilot, avoided going to the ranch, and ignored the pointed questions from everyone in town about Crawford's offer. Ethan sent a note on the second day. Just 3 words. Thinking of you. She kept it folded in her pocket and read it approximately 200 times. On the 4th day, Clara Bennett cornered her outside the mercantile. So when are you leaving for Helena? Clara asked, her tone making it clear she hoped the answer was immediately. I haven't decided yet. Haven't decided? Clara laughed. What's there to decide? You have a chance to leave this town and make something of yourself, unless... Her eyes narrowed. Unless you're actually foolish enough to think Ethan Mercer wants you to stay. That's none of your business. It's everyone's business when you make a spectacle of yourself. Clara's voice dropped to a mock whisper. He's just being polite, Margaret. Men like him don't end up with women like you. The sooner you accept that, the less embarrassing this will be for everyone. Something in Margaret snapped. She'd spent 4 days paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, trying to make the safe choice, the smart choice. And here was Clara Bennett, speaking aloud every cruel voice in her own head. And suddenly, Margaret was done listening to it. You know what, Clara? You're right. Men like Ethan don't usually end up with women like me. They end up with women like you, pretty and polite and so focused on appearances that they forget to be actual human beings. Margaret stepped closer. But maybe that's changing. Maybe some men are starting to realize that kindness and intelligence matter more than a pleasant face and the ability to make good tea. And maybe, just maybe, I'm done letting people like you tell me what I deserve. Clara's face went red. How dare... I dare because I have nothing left to lose. You've already decided what I am. The whole town has. So I might as well be exactly what you think I am. Reckless, desperate, foolish enough to believe someone might actually want me. Margaret walked away, her heart pounding. She didn't go home. Instead, she found herself walking toward the Mercer Ranch, her feet carrying her there before her mind could catch up. Ethan was in the barn, mucking out stalls. He looked up when she entered, surprise and hope warring on his face. Margaret, I didn't think... He set down the pitchfork. Is everything all right? No, she said. Nothing's all right. I'm terrified and confused, and I have no idea what I'm doing. Okay. Ethan wiped his hands on his pants, watching her carefully. Do you want to talk about it? Margaret stopped, took a breath. I want to know if you meant what you said, about missing me if I left. Every word. Even though I'm not even though we barely know each other, even though this whole thing is probably a mistake? Especially because of all that. Margaret felt tears threatening and fought them back. I got a job offer that could change my life. I could leave Red Hollow and start over somewhere no one knows me as the pitiful spinster. I could be someone new. I know. And I'm thinking about turning it down. For you. For a man I've known for 6 weeks. That's insane. Maybe. Ethan stepped closer. Or maybe it's brave. It doesn't feel brave. It feels reckless and stupid and... Margaret. He reached out and took her hands. You don't have to decide right now. You don't have to decide today or tomorrow or next week. Take Crawford's offer if you want it. Go to Helena. Try it out. If it's what you need, I'll understand. And if I stay, then we figure it out together, whatever it looks like. His grip on her hands tightened. But I need you to know something. I'm not asking you to stay for me. I'm asking you to stay for yourself. Because you want to, not because you're afraid of wanting to. The distinction felt important. Margaret looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and work-roughened, hers ink-stained and trembling slightly. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to want something for myself without wondering if I'm being selfish or foolish or... Then learn, Ethan said gently. Take your time, figure it out. I'm not going anywhere. Something in his voice, the steadiness, the patience, made her breath catch. This was what she'd been missing in all her careful calculations. The simple fact that Ethan was offering her time. Space to decide. No pressure, no ultimatums, just patience. The same patience she'd shown Storm. I need a few more days, Margaret said finally. Take them. She nodded, squeezed his hands once, and left. But as she walked back to town, something had shifted. The fear was still there, sharp and present. But underneath it was something else. Hope. Dangerous, fragile, impossible hope. That night, Margaret sat at her table and wrote 2 letters. The first was to James Crawford, thanking him for his generous offer and asking for 1 week to make her decision. The second was to herself, a list of everything she wanted, written in her own hand where no one else could see it. I want to stop being invisible. I want someone to choose me, not because I'm useful, but because I'm me. I want Storm's warm breath on my hands and Ethan's voice saying my name. I want to be brave enough to want these things out loud. She folded the second letter and tucked it into the back of her drawer beneath her winter stockings where no one would find it. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. Tomorrow, she would decide. But tonight, she let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to stay. The sky finally made good on its promise 2 days later. Snow began falling during breakfast, heavy and relentless, the kind of storm that turned the world white and silent. By noon, Red Hollow was buried under 6 inches, and the temperature had dropped so sharply that water froze in the buckets before you could carry it inside. Margaret dismissed her students early, watching them disappear into the white curtain of falling snow. She should go home. Light the stove, make tea, wait out the storm in safety. Instead, she found herself walking toward the Mercer Ranch. The wind cut through her coat like knives. Snow stung her face. By the time she could see the ranch buildings through the storm, she was shaking with cold. Ethan emerged from the barn, covered in snow, and stopped short when he saw her. Margaret, what are you doing out in this? I needed to... Her teeth were chattering too hard to finish. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the house. Come on, you'll freeze to death. The house was small but warm, a fire crackling in the stone fireplace. Ethan sat her down in front of it and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. What were you thinking? He demanded, but his voice was worried, not angry. This storm's only getting worse. I needed to tell you something, Margaret said, before I lost my nerve. Ethan knelt in front of her. All right, I'm listening. Margaret took a breath, her hands still shaking. I'm turning down Crawford's offer. Ethan's eyes widened. Margaret, I'm staying in Red Hollow. Not because I'm afraid to leave, not because I don't have other options, but because... She met his eyes. Because for the first time in my life, I want something more than I'm afraid of not getting it. What do you want? This. You. Whatever this is between us. Her voice was steadier now. I want to find out if it's real. I want to stop being safe and careful and start being... She struggled for the word. Alive. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't smooth or practiced. Their noses bumped. Margaret's hands were still trembling from the cold, but it was real and warm and utterly overwhelming. When they pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "You're sure?" he asked. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." He laughed, and it sounded like relief and joy mixed together. Outside, the storm howled louder. Thunder cracked across the sky, winter thunder, rare and ominous. And then they heard it, a crash from the direction of the corral, wood splintering, horses screaming in panic. Ethan was on his feet instantly, running for the door. Margaret followed. The scene outside was chaos. Lightning split the sky, bizarre and terrifying in the middle of a snowstorm. The corral fence had collapsed under the weight of the snow and wind, and horses were scattering in every direction, panicked by the thunder and the sudden freedom. And at the center of it all was Storm, rearing and plunging, his eyes white with terror. "No!" Ethan ran toward the corral, slipped in the snow, went down hard. Margaret heard him cry out in pain. The ranch hands were trying to corner the other horses, but Storm was beyond their reach, charging toward the open range where the storm would swallow him whole. Margaret didn't think. She ran directly into Storm's path. "Margaret, get back!" Ethan shouted, trying to stand and failing, but Margaret kept walking forward directly toward the terrified stallion. "Storm!" she called out, her voice cutting through the wind. "Storm, it's me!" The horse faltered, ears swiveling toward her voice. "It's all right," Margaret said, still walking. Snow whipped around her. Lightning flashed. "You're safe. I'm here." Storm stopped running. He stood trembling in the middle of the yard, sides heaving, snow gathering on his black coat. Margaret approached slowly, hands out, speaking in that same calm voice she'd used the very first day. "Nobody's going to hurt you, I promise. You're safe." Behind her, she could hear the ranch hands shouting, could hear Ethan calling her name, but she blocked it all out. Right now, there was only her and Storm. The horse took a step toward her, then another. Margaret stopped moving and let him come to her. Storm's nose touched her outstretched hand, his breath warm against her frozen skin. And then, slowly, he lowered his head and pressed his forehead against her chest. The same gesture of trust he'd given her that first time. Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck, and the stallion stood still, his shaking gradually subsiding. "Good boy," she whispered. "You're so brave." She didn't know how long they stood like that, seconds or minutes. Time felt strange and elastic, measured only in heartbeats and breath. Then Ethan was beside her, limping, his face pale but determined. "Is he all right?" Ethan asked quietly. "He's scared, but he's all right." Together they led Storm back toward the barn. The other horses had been corralled by the ranch hands. The broken fence could be fixed. Nobody was seriously hurt. Once Storm was safely in his stall, dry and calm, Ethan turned to Margaret. His face was streaked with blood from where he'd fallen. His leg was clearly paining him, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like awe. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you." "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "Or the stupidest." "Both, probably." Ethan reached out and touched her face. "Don't ever do that again." "I can't promise that." He laughed, and it sounded half crazy. "No, I suppose you can't." They stood in the quiet barn while the storm raged outside. Margaret was soaked through, shivering, her hands aching from the cold. And she'd never felt more certain of anything in her life. She'd made the right choice. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Red Hollow buried under a foot of snow that glittered painfully bright in the sunlight. Margaret woke on Ethan's couch, wrapped in blankets that smelled like wood smoke and horse, her body aching from the cold and exhaustion of the night before. Ethan was already awake, standing by the window with his weight on his good leg. His other ankle was wrapped in strips of torn cloth, sprained badly when he'd fallen, but not broken. "How long have you been up?" Margaret asked, her voice rough. He turned. "An hour, maybe. Couldn't sleep." "Your leg?" "My head." He limped over and sat down in the chair across from her. "Margaret, what you did last night was necessary," she interrupted. "Storm would have run into the mountains. In that storm, he would have died. And you could have died trying to save him. But I didn't." Ethan rubbed his face. "I know. But watching you walk toward that horse while lightning was cracking overhead, he stopped. I've never been that scared in my life. Margaret sat up, the blankets falling away. I'm sorry I frightened you, but I'm not sorry I did it. I know. That's what scares me most. His eyes were serious. You're not reckless by nature, Margaret, but when it comes to things you care about, you'll walk straight into danger without hesitating. He searched for words. That's terrifying. And brave, and I don't know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it. You just have to accept that this is who I am. Ethan studied her for a long moment. I do accept it. I just need you to understand that if we're doing this, if we're really trying to build something together, I'm going to worry. A lot. Probably more than you think is reasonable. I can live with that, Margaret said, as long as you can live with me not changing who I am to make you feel safer. Deal. The word hung between them, solid and real. A knock on the door broke the moment. One of the ranch hands stood outside, covered in snow. Boss, we got the fence mostly repaired, but you should come see something. They followed him outside. Margaret still in her wrinkled dress from yesterday, Ethan limping heavily, to where a group of ranch hands had gathered by the corral. Storm stood in the center, completely calm, while 3 other horses who'd scattered in the storm grazed peacefully around him. The stallion's ears were forward, his posture relaxed. When he saw Margaret, he walked directly to the fence and pushed his nose through the rails toward her. I ain't never seen anything like it, one of the hands said. After last night, I figured he'd be wild as hell, but he's calmer than before the storm. Margaret reached through and stroked Storm's nose. Fear doesn't last forever. Once you get through it and realize you survived, sometimes you're stronger than you were before. The ranch hand gave her a strange look, like she'd said something profound instead of obvious. Word's already spread to town, another hand said, about what happened last night. Half of Red Hollow's talking about how Miss Whitmore walked into a lightning storm to save a horse. Margaret felt her stomach drop. They're making it sound more dramatic than it was. Ma'am, with respect, it was pretty damn dramatic. The hand grinned. Mrs. Bennett said you must have lost your mind. Then Thomas Brennan, your student, told her his teacher was the bravest person in the territory. Kid wouldn't back down even when she got mad at him. Despite everything, Margaret smiled. That sounds like Thomas. Anyway, folks are talking. Thought you should know. After the hands dispersed, Ethan turned to Margaret. You know what this means? More gossip? Different gossip. His expression was thoughtful. You're not the pitiful spinster anymore, Margaret. You're the woman who saved the horses in the storm. That's a different story entirely. Stories change, Margaret said. People don't. They'll find something else to judge me for soon enough. Maybe. But at least now they have to acknowledge that you're more than they thought you were. Margaret wasn't sure that mattered. She'd spent 17 years trying to prove her worth to people who'd already decided she had none. But maybe Ethan was right. Maybe some stories, once they shifted, didn't shift back. The walk back to town took twice as long as usual, the snow making every step difficult. By the time Margaret reached her house, she was exhausted and frozen through. But when she opened her door, she found Ruth Ann waiting inside with a pot of hot soup and fresh bread. Don't ask how I got in, Ruth Ann said. Your lock is terrible, and everyone knows it. She ladled soup into a bowl. Now sit down and tell me everything. Margaret sat, and for the first time in years, she told someone the complete, unfiltered truth. About Storm, about Ethan, about turning down Crawford's offer, about walking into the storm because some things mattered more than safety, about kissing a man she barely knew and feeling more certain of it than anything else in her life. Ruth Ann listened without interrupting. When Margaret finally finished, Ruth Ann was quiet for a long moment. Are you happy? She asked finally. The question caught Margaret off guard. I don't know. I'm terrified and uncertain, and I have no idea if I made the right choice. That's not what I asked. Are you happy? Margaret considered. She thought about Storm's warm breath on her hands, about Ethan's voice saying her name, about choosing want over safety for the first time in her adult life. Yes, she said quietly. I think I am. Ruth Ann smiled. Then you made the right choice. Even if it falls apart? Even then, because you chose it. That's what matters. The word settled into Margaret's chest, warm and unexpected. She'd spent so long measuring her choices by their outcomes, by whether they worked, whether they were safe, whether they protected her from more pain. But maybe Ruth Ann was right. Maybe the choosing itself was what mattered. The next week passed in a strange, suspended kind of time. Margaret taught her classes and helped repair the storm damage at the ranch. She and Ethan moved around each other carefully, like people learning a new language, uncertain of the rules but willing to try. They didn't kiss again. They barely touched. But there was an awareness between them now, a promise of something that hadn't been named yet. And the town, as predicted, talked. But the talk was different now, less pitying, more curious. Margaret heard fragments of conversations as she walked past the mercantile or the church. Walked right up to that horse while lightning was striking. Heard Ethan Mercer's ranch is doing better than ever. Not what I expected from someone so quiet. It wasn't universal praise. Clara Bennett still made snide comments. Vernon Pike glared at her whenever their paths crossed. Some of the older women still whispered behind their hands, but something had shifted. Margaret was no longer just the spinster schoolteacher. She was the woman who'd saved the horses, the woman who'd done something impossible. It wasn't enough to erase 17 years of judgment, but it was a start. On Saturday morning, a rider arrived from Helena with a letter from James Crawford. Margaret opened it at her kitchen table, her hand steady. Miss Whitmore, I received your letter declining my employment offer. While I'm disappointed, I understand that circumstances change and respect your decision. However, I wanted to extend a different offer. Should you ever change your mind, or should you wish to consult on difficult cases from time to time, my door remains open. Your skills are rare and valuable, and I hope we might work together in some capacity in the future. Respectfully, James Crawford. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in her drawer next to the list of things she wanted. It felt like a door staying open instead of closing, like possibility instead of finality. She could live with that. That afternoon, Ethan appeared at her door holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? Margaret asked. Open it. Inside was a book, leather-bound, clearly expensive, titled The Art of Horse Training, Patience and Understanding. On the first page, in Ethan's careful handwriting, was an inscription. For Margaret, who taught me that understanding matters more than force. Thank you for seeing what no one else could see. Margaret's throat went tight. Ethan, this is too much. It's not enough, but it's a start. He shifted his weight awkwardly. I also wanted to ask you something. All right. The investors are coming back next month. They want to see the progress with the breeding program, and they specifically asked if you'd be there to demonstrate your methods with Storm. He paused. Would you consider it? Not as a favor to me, but as a partner in this. I want your name on the program. Your methods taught to the hands. Your insight valued the way it should be. Margaret stared at him. You want me to be part of the ranch? Officially? If you want to be. I know you have your teaching, and I'm not asking you to give that up. But maybe... He stopped, searching for words. Maybe we could build something together. Not just you and me personally, but something bigger. A ranch that treats animals differently, that values patience over force. It was the most he'd said about the future, and it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. What would that look like? Margaret asked carefully. I don't know yet. We'd figure it out as we go. Ethan's eyes were steady on hers. But I know I want you to be part of it, in whatever way makes sense. Margaret thought about her classroom, about the children who needed her, about the life she'd built alone, careful and small and safe. Then she thought about Storm, about mornings at the ranch, about Ethan's voice saying she was stronger than anyone gave her credit for. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. He left, and Margaret sat with the book in her lap, running her fingers over the smooth leather cover. Partnership. Collaboration. Building something together. The words felt foreign and wonderful. 2 weeks later, Vernon Pike showed up at the schoolhouse just as Margaret was dismissing her students for the day. We need to talk, he said without preamble. Margaret sent the last child out and turned to face him. If you're here to threaten me again, I'm not. Pike's expression was difficult to read. I'm here to make you an offer. I'm not interested in anything you have to offer. Hear me out. Pike crossed his arms. The investors were impressed with what you did. With the storm. They think you're an asset. And I think you're a complication, but I'm also a businessman. His eyes were calculating. So here's what I'm proposing. You agree to train horses for my ranch, paid work, respectable, and I'll stop spreading rumors about you and Mercer. Margaret laughed, and it came out bitter. You think I care about rumors anymore? You should, because the rumors I could spread now are different than before. Pike's smile was cold. Before, you were pathetic. Now you're dangerous. A woman who manipulates men through sentiment, who uses animals to make herself indispensable, who— Get out, Margaret said quietly. Think about what I'm offering. I said get out. Her voice was steel now. I don't work for bullies. I don't care how much you pay or what lies you threaten to tell. The answer is no. Pike's face darkened. You're making a mistake. Probably, but it's my mistake to make. He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Margaret sat down at her desk, her hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. For 17 years, she'd been afraid of men like Vernon Pike, afraid of their power, their connections, their ability to destroy her reputation with a word. But Pike had been right about one thing. The story had changed. She wasn't the woman nobody wanted anymore. She was the woman who'd walked into a storm, the woman who'd stood up to Clara Bennett and Vernon Pike himself, the woman who'd chosen what she wanted over what was safe. And that woman didn't bow to threats. That evening, Margaret walked to the Mercer Ranch without being invited. Ethan was in the barn, brushing down one of the mares, and he looked up in surprise when she entered. Pike came to see me today, Margaret said without preamble. Ethan's expression darkened. What did he want? To buy my cooperation. When I refused, he threatened to spread new rumors about how I'm manipulating you through sentiment. That's ridiculous. Of course it is. But it's also exactly the kind of story this town would believe. Margaret took a breath. Ethan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. All right. Are you ashamed of this? Of us? She gestured between them. Because if you are, if having me here makes your life harder in ways that matter, I need to know now. Ethan set down the brush and walked over to her. Margaret, look at me. She did. I am not ashamed of you. I have never been ashamed of you. And if Vernon Pike or anyone else in this town has a problem with the fact that I care about you, they can go to hell. The words were so fierce, so unexpected, that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The town will talk, she said. Let them. It could hurt your business. I don't care. You should care. The ranch will survive, or it won't. But I'm not building a life based on what Vernon Pike approves of. Ethan took her hands. I'm done apologizing for seeing what everyone else was too blind to notice. I'm done pretending you're not the best thing that's happened to me in years. And if that makes me weak or foolish in their eyes, so be it. Margaret's breath caught. Ethan, I love you, he said simply. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And I'm tired of not saying it. The world seemed to stop. Margaret had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways over the past weeks. Imagined it happening slowly, carefully, with all the proper courtship rituals in place. She hadn't imagined it happening in a barn that smelled like hay and horse, with both of them still covered in the day's dirt. But it was perfect anyway. I love you too, she said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff. I'm terrified and I have no idea what I'm doing, but I love you. Ethan pulled her into his arms, and Margaret let herself be held, really held, for the first time in 17 years. What do we do now? She asked against his shoulder. Whatever we want, Ethan said. Together. The next month passed in a blur of quiet mornings and stolen moments. Margaret continued teaching during the week and spent her weekends at the ranch, working with Storm and the other horses. Ethan started including her in decisions about the breeding program, valuing her opinion the way he'd value any partners. The town talked, of course, but the talk had shifted from mockery to confusion to grudging acceptance. Some people still disapproved. Clara Bennett still made snide comments, but others, like Ruth Ann, like Thomas Brennan's parents, like the gray-haired investor James Crawford, began to treat Margaret differently. Not with pity, with respect. It was strange and uncomfortable and wonderful. One evening in early April, as the snow finally began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, Ethan asked Margaret to take a walk with him. They headed to the creek where the ice was breaking up and the water ran fast and cold. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I've been thinking," Ethan said as they walked, "about the future, about what we're building here." "All right, I want to ask you something, but I need you to know there's no pressure, no expectations, just a question." Margaret's heart started to beat faster. "Go ahead." Ethan stopped walking and turned to face her. "Margaret Whitmore, will you marry me?" The question hung in the cool spring air. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. At the man who'd asked for her help when he was desperate, who'd listened when everyone else dismissed her, who'd stood beside her when the whole town was watching, who'd somehow, impossibly, seen her as she was and decided she was enough. "Yes," she said, "but on one condition." Ethan's eyes widened. "What condition?" "That we're equals. In everything. The ranch, the decisions, the life we build. I won't be the woman who exists in your shadow, and I won't let you exist in mine. We do this together, or we don't do it at all." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He kissed her then, properly this time, without the awkwardness of that first attempt. And Margaret kissed him back, tasting spring and possibility and the strange, terrifying joy of choosing to be vulnerable with another person. When they pulled apart, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver band. "It was my mother's," he said. It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Margaret said. He slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, and for the first time in 17 years, Margaret felt like she was walking towards something instead of away from it. The wedding was small and quiet, held on a warm Saturday in May with just a handful of people in attendance. Ruth Ann stood beside Margaret as her witness. One of Ethan's ranch hands stood beside him. Thomas Brennan and his sister brought wildflowers they'd picked that morning. Vernon Pike didn't come. Neither did Clara Bennett. But Margaret found she didn't care. The people who mattered were there. That was enough. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. No grand declarations, no performative romance. Just two people making a promise to try, to build something together, to be honest, to choose each other even when it was difficult. When it was over, Ethan kissed her gently, carefully, like she was something precious, and Margaret kissed him back, unafraid. The small gathering moved to the ranch for a simple meal. Someone played a fiddle. Thomas and Sarah danced in the yard. Storm watched from the corral, ears forward, completely calm. As the sun began to set, Margaret found herself standing by the fence, watching the horses graze in the fading light. Ruth Ann appeared beside her. "How does it feel?" "Strange," Margaret admitted. "Good, strange. But strange. You did it, you know. You chose what you wanted instead of what was safe. And I still don't know if it was the right choice." "There's no such thing as a right choice," Ruth Ann said. "There's just the choice you make and what you do with it afterward." Margaret thought about that, about how she'd spent 17 years trying to make the right choices, the safe ones, the careful ones, and had ended up lonely anyway. About how choosing Ethan had been reckless and uncertain and terrifying, but it had also been hers. "Thank you," Margaret said, "for being here, for being my friend when no one else was." Ruth Ann squeezed her hand. "Always." That night, after everyone had left and the ranch was quiet, Margaret and Ethan sat on the porch of what was now their house. The stars were bright overhead, undimmed by clouds or snow. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked. Margaret considered. "That I spent 17 years invisible, and now I'm not. And I don't quite know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it. You just have to be yourself." "That's what scares me. What if myself isn't enough?" Ethan turned to look at her. "Margaret, you walked into a lightning storm to save a terrified horse. You stood up to Vernon Pike. You chose me when it would have been easier to choose safety. How is any of that not enough?" "Because I still wake up some mornings expecting to be back in my old house, alone, waiting for my life to start." She paused. "What if I'm not brave enough to keep doing this, to keep choosing want over safety?" "Then we'll figure it out together." Ethan took her hand. "That's what marriage is, isn't it? Not being perfect, just being willing to try. Margaret looked at their joined hands, his scarred and work-roughened, hers ink-stained and trembling slightly, the same hands that had gentled a terrified horse, that had built something impossible out of patience and trust. "I can do that," she said finally. "I can try. That's all I'm asking." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. And Margaret realized something. For 17 years, she'd measured her worth by whether anyone chose her, by whether she was pretty enough, useful enough, small enough to fit into the space the world had carved out for women like her. But worth wasn't something someone else gave you. It was something you claimed for yourself. She'd walked into a storm because a horse needed her. She'd stood up to Vernon Pike because she was tired of being afraid. She'd chosen Ethan not because he completed her, but because he saw her as she was and didn't ask her to be less. And maybe that was the point. Not to be chosen, but to choose. To choose bravery over safety, honesty over performance, want over should. The next morning, Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and Ethan's steady breathing beside her. For a moment, she felt disoriented. This wasn't her small house, her narrow bed, her carefully controlled solitude. Then she remembered. This was her life now, shared and messy and uncertain, and hers. She got up quietly and walked outside. The ranch was already coming to life. Hands moving between buildings, horses calling to each other, the smell of coffee drifting from the bunkhouse. Storm stood in his corral, and when he saw Margaret, he walked directly to the fence. She reached through and stroked his nose. "Morning, beautiful boy." The stallion leaned into her touch, completely trusting. Margaret thought about the first time she'd seen him, wild and terrified, lashing out at everything that came near. Thought about the slow, patient work of teaching him that the world could be safe if he let it. She'd done the same work on herself, she realized. Learned that wanting things didn't make her desperate, that being seen didn't make her weak, that choosing vulnerability was the bravest thing she'd ever done. "You turned out all right," she told Storm. "Didn't you?" The horse snorted softly, as if agreeing. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Ethan appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Just wanted to see the sunrise." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully. "It's different from here. Better." "Everything's better from here," Ethan said. Then more quietly, "Are you happy, Margaret?" She thought about the question, about 17 years of carefully managed expectations and small, safe dreams, about what it meant to want something bigger than safety. "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "I have no idea what I'm doing. I wake up some mornings convinced I've made a terrible mistake." "That's not what I asked," Margaret smiled. "I know, and yes, I'm happy." Ethan kissed her temple. "Good. That's all I wanted to know." They stood together in the morning light, drinking coffee and watching Storm graze peacefully. And Margaret realized something else. She'd spent 17 years being the woman nobody chose, the cautionary tale, the pitiful spinster who'd let life pass her by. But that story was wrong. She hadn't been waiting for someone to choose her. She'd been learning who she was, building strength in quiet, invisible ways, becoming someone who could walk into a storm without flinching. And when the moment came, when Ethan needed help and Storm needed patience and her own heart demanded courage, she'd been ready. Not because someone else had made her ready, because she'd made herself ready. That was the story that mattered, not the ending where someone finally chose her, but the middle part. The years of teaching children and enduring mockery and refusing to let cruelty make her cruel. The quiet dignity of building a life that mattered even when no one was watching. The woman nobody chose had chosen herself, and that made all the difference. 3 months later, when the investors returned to evaluate the breeding program, they found a ranch transformed. The corrals were repaired and expanded. The horses were calm and well-trained. And at the center of it all was Storm, the stallion everyone had called untamable, now the cornerstone of the program. Vernon Pike stood at the edge of the group, his face carefully neutral. But Margaret saw the defeat in his eyes, saw the way he avoided looking at her directly. "Good." James Crawford approached Margaret during the tour. "Miss Whitmore, or should I say Mrs. Mercer now?" "Margaret is fine." "Margaret, then. I wanted to tell you that your methods are being discussed at ranches across 3 territories. People want to know how you did it." "Patience," Margaret said simply. and actually listening instead of assuming you know better than the animal you're trying to help. Crawford smiled. Would you be willing to consult? Not full time. I know you have your teaching and the ranch here, but occasionally, when we have a particularly difficult case. Margaret glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I ask. After the investors left, pleased with what they'd seen, committed to continued funding, Ethan turned to Margaret. You know what this means? He said. You're going to be famous. The woman who tamed the untamable horse. I didn't tame him. I just helped him feel safe. Same thing. No, Margaret said firmly. It's not. Taming implies breaking. What we did was build trust. That's different. Ethan studied her for a moment. You're right. It is different. He paused. I'm proud of you. You know that? The words hit her harder than they should have. In 17 years, no one had ever said they were proud of her. Thank you, Margaret managed. I mean it. You took something everyone had given up on and turned it into something beautiful. Not just Storm. The whole program. The way people think about working with animals. He smiled. You changed things, Margaret. We changed things, she corrected. Together. That evening, Margaret sat at the desk in their shared office, a small room off the main house, where they kept records and correspondence, and wrote a letter to James Crawford accepting his consulting offer on a limited basis. Then she pulled out the list she'd written months ago, the one tucked in the back of her drawer beneath her winter stockings. I want to stop being invisible. I want someone to choose me, not because I'm useful, but because I'm me. I want Storm's warm breath on my hands and Ethan's voice saying my name. I want to be brave enough to want these things out loud. She read it over 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her new desk. Not because she needed it anymore, but because it was a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd become. The woman who'd written that list had been terrified of wanting anything, convinced that desire itself was dangerous. The woman reading it now knew better. Wanting things was what made you human. Acting on those wants, choosing them, fighting for them, building a life around them, that was what made you brave. 6 months after the wedding, Margaret stood in front of her classroom and made an announcement. I've been offered a position consulting on horse training across several territories. It would mean traveling occasionally, being away from the classroom for a week or 2 at a time. She paused. I wanted you to know before I made my decision. This classroom, these lessons, all of you, you matter to me. And if you think having a substitute teacher that frequently would be too disruptive, I'll turn down the offer. Thomas Brennan raised his hand. Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Mercer, can I say something? Of course, Thomas. You taught us that being brave means doing things even when they scare you. And you taught us that helping others is important. He looked around at the other students. So I think you should take the job, because you'd be helping people and being brave, and that's what you always tell us to do. Out of the mouths of children, Margaret thought. Does everyone else agree? She asked. A chorus of yeses filled the classroom. Then I'll accept, Margaret said, but only if you all promise to work just as hard for the substitute teacher as you do for me. More agreements. That night, Margaret wrote her acceptance to James Crawford, and the following week she began the work that would define the rest of her life, teaching patience and understanding, showing people that force was never the answer, that the things labeled broken were often just frightened. The years that followed weren't perfect. There were hard winters and failed harvests, times when money was tight and the ranch struggled, arguments between Margaret and Ethan about business decisions and personal matters alike, but there was also joy. Storm sired a line of exceptional horses that became known across 3 territories. Margaret's consulting work expanded until she was recognized as one of the finest horse trainers in the region. Ethan's ranch became a model for humane animal treatment, and together they built a life that was messy and real and entirely theirs. On their 10th anniversary, Margaret stood by Storm's corral, older now, the stallion moving a bit slower but still magnificent, and thought about the woman she'd been. The spinster schoolteacher, the woman nobody wanted, the cautionary tale. That woman felt like a stranger now. Not because Margaret had changed completely. She was still quiet, still preferred books to parties, still sometimes woke up uncertain and afraid. But she'd learned something those 17 years had tried to teach her. That being overlooked didn't mean being worthless. that other people's judgments said more about them than about her, that the things she'd been taught to see as flaws, her age, her plainness, her quiet strength, were actually the foundation of everything good in her life. She'd stopped waiting to be chosen and started choosing herself. And everything else had followed. Ethan appeared beside her, his hair showing gray now at the temples, his face lined from years of sun and wind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first time I saw Storm, how terrified he was, how everyone wanted to give up on him. And you didn't." "No," Margaret said. "I didn't." "Why not?" She considered the question. "Because I knew what it felt like to be judged before anyone bothered to understand. And I thought, if no one was going to give him a chance, at least I could try." Ethan put his arm around her. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you weren't just trying to save Storm. You were trying to save yourself." Margaret turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "You spent 17 years being told you weren't enough, that you were too old, too plain, too quiet. And then you met a horse everyone said was too broken to fix, and you proved them all wrong." Ethan smiled. "By saving Storm, you proved to yourself that broken things can heal, that patience matters, that understanding is stronger than force." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Maybe you're right." "I'm always right," Ethan said, grinning. She laughed and elbowed him gently. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Storm graze peacefully in the fading light. And Margaret realized that this quiet moment with a man she loved and a horse she'd saved, this was what she'd been searching for all those years. Not perfection, not rescue, not validation from people who'd never bothered to see her clearly. Just this. The simple, profound joy of being seen, of being chosen, yes, but more importantly, of choosing. Choosing bravery over safety, honesty over performance, want over should. The woman nobody chose had become the woman who chose her own life. And in the end, that made all the difference. Years later, when people in Red Hollow told stories about Margaret Whitmore Mercer, they talked about the storm, about how she'd walked into lightning to save a terrified stallion, about how she'd changed the way people thought about horses and training and patience. But they missed the real story. The real story wasn't about a single dramatic moment. It was about 17 years of quiet dignity, of refusing to let cruelty make you cruel, of building strength in invisible ways until the moment came when that strength was needed. The real story was about a woman who'd been overlooked and underestimated and dismissed, who'd learned that none of those things defined her worth. The real story was about choosing yourself when no one else would. That was the story that mattered. And it was the one Margaret carried with her every day for the rest of her life. A reminder that the bravest thing you could do was want something, admit you wanted it, and fight like hell to build a life around it. Not because it was easy, but because it was yours.